In the world of the dead, Necropia, a realm where no trace of life can be found, a grand castle stood amidst the barren lands, the only castle in Necropia. Countless indescribable things could be found there. Endless rows of golden pillars rose all around, and majestic paintings covered the walls. A vast marble hall with elegant sculptures gracefully carved atop everything, a symbol of absolute power, the master of all that existed there, the absolute ruler of Necropia, the king of death named Karnak. Being a transcendent and ruler of death, it had only been 100 years since he came to a conclusion. A human should not rule something like death. When he was human, Karnak was an illegitimate child of a noble. In his youth, he lost his mother to the violence in his home, relying only on himself. Karnak naturally developed a desire to become powerful. It was then that he accidentally discovered a forbidden text about necromancy. In the end, he strayed from the path of humanity. Soon after, Karnak brought all humans and his kingdom to death with his vast power. The 4 great martial kings and the 3 sage archmages tried to resist, waging a brutal battle. But in the end, Karnak turned them all into his loyal servants. The world's guardians also tried to stop Karnak. However, when he turned the last guardian of the world, the dragon emperor Gritaria, into his subordinate, Karnak transformed his own flesh into the supreme ascendant, Astra Schnapf. With that, he became the most powerful necromancer. The king of death had emerged. Karnak thought everything had become his, that he could do whatever he wanted. But that was 70 years ago. The protagonist wonders what he could do, being just a bag of bones. Karnak questions how much longer he would have to keep living this way. A gentle, refreshing breeze on a sunny morning, the comforting touch of a human, or even a terrible pain deeply felt in the flesh. Karnak thinks that either would be better than this empty, tedious life he leads. The protagonist says that there is still hope. He looks at a scripture on the stone, thinking that if it works. Suddenly, someone starts to approach, calling Karnak Lord of all the dead, Master of life and death, Emperor of the continent. He says he greets His Majesty, the King of Death, Karnak. This is Baros, the General Commander of the Legion of Death. Karnak looks at him and says that everything is ready. Baros asks what it really is. Karnak laughs, saying he has the impression that it will work this time. Baros starts getting all excited, saying that finally, with Baros's help, the protagonist has been searching for a way to feel the pleasures of the flesh again. Vampirism, possession. The pleasures work by filling the voids one has. Karnak thinks that for them, the Ascendants, no method worked. But as he was an Ascendant, he was eventually able to find an answer to the search for pleasure. If they couldn't feel human pleasures because they weren't human, they could simply return to the time when they were human. Karnak says he wanted to go back to the day when he obtained the dark magical power. Baros asks if they fail, would their existences disappear? Karnak asks him why he is so attached to the life he currently has. The protagonist says that if Baros asked, he would leave him there and try to go back alone. Baros looks at his leader and says he would never do that, emphasizing that it's all or nothing, and urges his master to get on with it. Karnak says they will go back to those days. The two start to touch the stone, and a strong light fills the place. He thinks they will go back to the time when they were human. Everything turns white, and suddenly the protagonist starts to hear a voice calling him. Karnak begins to slowly open his eyes and starts to hear more clearly someone calling him. As soon as he wakes up more fully, a man was looking at him, saying that he had finally woken up. Karnak asks if the man in front of him is Baros. The man smiles, confirming that it is indeed him. Baros remarks that it had been a while since he had seen the protagonist's human face. Baros says that the protagonist is exactly the same as before, skinny, black hair, and even the same arrogance. The protagonist wonders if he really looks like that. Karnak comments that Baros is as cheeky as ever. Karnak stands up, searching for something. He says that if they really did successfully return, he finally finds it and says that this is where it all began. He explains that he followed the path of necromancy with the knowledge he obtained from this codex. The protagonist says that he would test it. He snaps his fingers, and a lightning bolt shoots from his hand, hitting the book, which begins to burn. Baros doesn't understand why he did that. Karnak says that this was the power he had back then. Baros asks if it's really safe to burn the codex like that. Karnak replies that it doesn't matter because he has everything absolutely memorized. He emphasizes that although it's a forbidden codex, there was nothing fantastic about it. It was all very basic. The protagonist comments that it's better not to leave any trace of it. Baros looks at the protagonist, saying that he really thought of everything, and mentions that he even seems more radiant. The two look at each other, and suddenly their stomachs growl. They marvel at this. Karnak asks how long it's been since they last heard that sound. Baros smiles, saying he feels like eating. The two leave the cave as the protagonist says they're going to look for something to eat. Baros cheers at this. In the city, people passing by on the street were startled by the shouts of, "This is so delicious." Inside the restaurant, even the people were looking at them. Barros was shouting, asking where they had made that bread because it was a work of art. He emphasizes that he could feel everything. He takes another bite of the bread, crying, and shouts again, saying that he would die to feel this every day. Karnak also starts crying and shouts to Barros that they can't talk about death after everything he did to bring them back to life. Barros says it's just an expression. He comments that coming back to life was really the best thing, emphasizing that the food was so delicious. He couldn't stop crying. Karnak, also crying, says he understands, but that he shouldn't overdo it because money doesn't grow on trees. He tells Barros that he has to chew over and over again to really savor it. Barros asks the protagonist to control himself as well, but he himself couldn't stay calm. The protagonist says he's about to faint just from the smell. The waiter serves a roasted chicken at the next table. As soon as they notice it, the two quickly turn and wonder if that's chicken and if that restaurant has any awards. The protagonist wonders how much it costs because he would love to eat some juicy meat right now. He says there's no way they could afford that because he comes from a ruined noble family. The protagonist starts smiling, saying that maybe he could just kill everyone there and take the meat for himself. Barros goes crazy at this, shouting that he can't do that and begs the protagonist to calm down. Barros emphasizes that with their current strength, they would get beaten up, so he should stay calm while Barros checks how much money they have. He opens the coin pouch and says that being poor should be a sin. He asks if they should just order one more piece of bread. Barros notices something and calls his master. He says that they have a big problem. Karnak asks what he means by that. Barros replies that something went wrong with their time travel. The protagonist looks at the pouch and says that this is very strange. Barros comments that there is definitely something wrong. He couldn't believe they had so many coins like that, and most of them were silver. Karnak wonders when things started to go wrong. Back then, his family's financial situation was very precarious. As a result, his grandfather, Baron Grelid, started several businesses in the territory, but failed in all of them, leaving only debts for the protagonist's father, Baron Kraput. Unfortunately, he was unable to manage the debts, which only grew larger. Moreover, the two sons from his original wife were two useless brats to the family. Karnak, the illegitimate child born in the midst of this family's collapse, received all the scorn and disdain, barely surviving as the days went by. He thinks that at least that's how his family should be. So how? The protagonist takes the coins in his hand and wonders where all that money came from. He comments that they shouldn't celebrate, as perhaps the time-space regression magic went wrong. Barros says he has no idea since he was just a knight. The protagonist begins to worry, wondering if they didn't actually return to the past, but he's confused because everything looks just like he remembers. While Karnak is concerned, Barros calls him, saying that this means they can eat chicken because the smell is driving him crazy. The protagonist is delighted by the idea. Barros comments that nothing stops them from using that money. The two start imagining the king chicken. Karnak agrees, saying they would be able to think better on a full stomach. Barros, with his mouth watering, suggests they could order just one. The protagonist replies that he doesn't want to share, so they'll get one for each of them. They shout to the waiter, ordering 2 whole chickens. A few hours later, they are both full. Barros is round from eating so much. He pats his belly, sighing, and says he's stuffed, having eaten so much that he might fall into a food coma. As they ride their horses, Karnak comments that they could sleep as soon as they get back. Barros says that having to see those people again is a bit annoying because they're probably the same, and he says he hates those people. The protagonist responds that they'll be fine as long as they don't pay attention to any of them, emphasizing that he's no longer the same as he was back then. Karnak comments that the problem is how strange things are. Barros agrees, saying it's not like there are just 1 or 2 strange things. He notes that even the horse was strange. He asks if the protagonist noticed how the manager was sucking up to them, smiling, and saying they would take the best possible care of the horses. It didn't make sense for a family of failures to have such high-quality horses. Barros says that even the citizens they saw earlier, those who used to call them failure and assistant of the failure, surprised them when it happened. The people were happy to see them and even cried. Barros comments that he thought they were in an inn. The protagonist agrees, saying that all of this is indeed very strange. Barros says they will figure out a lot once they get home, as they're almost there. Looking at the entire place, Karnak comments that he's feeling nostalgic because it's been a long time since he's seen it. Barros, however, says he doesn't feel that way because he doesn't have good memories there. Barros was an orphan and didn't live a very good life. His parents were crappy mercenaries who abandoned him in the middle of the night. Karnak found him alone and brought him home, and to the protagonist's surprise, Kraput allowed it. Karnak thinks that even though he was an illegitimate child, the family needed to maintain appearances, and he would need some kind of assistant. Barros taps the protagonist's shoulder, calling him. The protagonist asks what he wants. Barros points to the house, asking if that's really the gestured house. The protagonist looks and confirms it, but is speechless. The house was perfectly beautiful. Barros asks if they went to the wrong place. Karnak says no, it's definitely the right place. A large brick wall, a 2-story building with a terrace, a large garden around it. He thinks it's the same, but it's still impressive. He comments that it looks like the whole place was renovated, but he doesn't know where all the money came from. As soon as the guards see them, they smile, calling out to the protagonist. Karnak is amazed, thinking that even the gatekeeper is now welcoming him. The other guard reprimands the first one, saying that's not how they should speak. Both of them bow and say, "Welcome, my lord," leaving Karnak and Barros completely shocked, not understanding anything, and wondering why they were called Lord. They finally enter the family mansion. Someone mentions that it's been 6 months since the protagonist became the head of the family. The two are in disbelief when they hear this. The protagonist asks if it really has been 6 months. The butler, named Japel Plead, smiles and asks if the protagonist got what he wanted. Karnak, confused, asks what it is he wanted. Japel asks if that wasn't the reason for his journey. The protagonist, still lost in the situation, doesn't know what to say. Japel says he's glad, noting that the former lord and Isabella were also pleased. Once again, the two are shocked by this. The protagonist wonders if his father and stepmother really did die. Japel comments that after the deaths of Tessel and Farrelth, the atmosphere became quite strange, but it seems to have improved now. Karnak thinks that's why he became the lord and wonders what the hell is happening and why his entire family is dead. The reason for his journey was obvious. He was probably mastering necromancy while no one was paying attention. Barros bends down and quietly speaks to the protagonist, saying he doubted that he had revealed his true objectives. Karnak agrees, commenting that he must have made up some other story to justify the journey, but he doesn't understand why he would use necromancy in a situation like this. Japel, with a beautiful smile on his face, asks what is troubling the protagonist. Barros steps in and says that the protagonist was just mentioning that the journey had left him tired, and asks if they could continue the conversation tomorrow. Japel becomes desperate, apologizing and saying he hadn't considered it from that perspective. He asks the protagonist to hurry and rest in his room. As soon as Japel leaves the room, the two clasp hands. Karnak says that Barros did a good job. Barros replies that they got away with it for now, but asks what they're going to do, as everything Japel said is news to him, and he has no idea what's happening there. Karnak asks if there's anything they can do in a situation like this. Barros asks what that would be, and the protagonist, smiling, says they need to leave soon, taking advantage of the fact that everyone is asleep. During the night, Japel was sleeping, and the two went to his room. Barros comments that the butler was sleeping like a rock. He hands a bowl to the protagonist, saying these are the medicinal herbs he prepared, noting that it took him a while to get them. Karnak takes them and says it's time to start the mental probing. He applies a bit of magic to the bowl, and the smoke from the herbs begins to enter Japel's nose. The protagonist says, "Rise, my servant." Suddenly the butler opens his eyes and stands up, exuding a strange aura, and responds, "Yes, master." The protagonist orders him to explain in detail how Zastrod's finances recovered and how he became the family's patriarch. Japel begins to explain that it happened 4 years ago, while the second eldest son was on his training journey. He ended up discovering a large copper mine and brought financial stability to them. The protagonist is astonished by this and asks if nobles don't usually use a copper mine as an excuse to hide dirty money. Barros comments that this is true, but emphasizes that Japel couldn't lie in this state. Karnak asks why everyone in the family died within 4 years. The butler explains that the problem was the location of the copper mine, which was in the neutral zone between the Zastrod house and Viscount Deventor. Both houses claimed ownership of the mine, and this resulted in a war between the domains. Deventor was powerful, amassing forces since the previous generation. Japel notes that the biggest obstacle was Sir Randolph, who single-handedly decapitated Baron Kraput, the former patriarch, and also killed the first son, young Master Tessel. The strongest knight of the Zastrod house, the second eldest son Farrelth, lost his legs because of Randolph and took his own life. Even the Baroness fell ill from the shock and eventually died. As a result, Lord Karnak became the successor, even though he was not of age, and the two houses agreed to a ceasefire until he came of age to officially become the patriarch. However, everyone was still worried because of the copper mine and the significant profits at stake in the war. That's when the protagonist brought forth a way to save the Zastrod house. Karnak stepped forward and shouted, "In the name of Alium, goddess of the moon and justice, we request a trial by combat against Viscount Deventor." The protagonist starts shouting, asking Japel to wait a moment. He asks why he requested this trial. Barros questions why the protagonist thought he could do something so risky. Trial by combat is a duel conducted according to the doctrine of Alium, the goddess of the moon and justice. It allows a champion to participate in the duel in place of another person. The process is presided over by a priest of Alium and is decided by the death of one of the parties. Barros tells the protagonist that he dug his own grave, but Karnak responds that he didn't, emphasizing that this is why everyone likes him now. Since the battle is determined by the quality of the combatants, he must have opted for a trial by combat instead of a war between domains. This way, Deventor couldn't refuse the offer, or else they would suffer a blow to their reputation. The protagonist comments that if they give up the copper mine alone and not the compensation, at least by doing the trial by combat, they wouldn't starve. So, he thinks this was the best possible decision. Barros says that if the protagonist fights with the skills he currently has, he'll just die in vain. Karnak says that's why he's going to prepare perfectly. He asks when the trial by combat is scheduled. Japel responds that it's in a month. The two are shocked, thinking it's sooner than they expected. After some time, the two go to the table, which is filled with food. In a trembling voice, Barros asks the protagonist what all this is for. Karnak says it's for Barros, since he's been working so hard, so he can eat as much as he wants. Delighted by all of it, Barros shouts, thanking him for the food. As he eats, Barros asks if it's okay for them to be doing this, considering the duel is approaching. The protagonist smiles and asks if Barros wouldn't like to participate in his place, suggesting that he could be the champion. While eating, Barros comments that there's a reason behind all this, but he declines, saying that for now, it's impossible for him. Karnak asks why it would be impossible, since Barros had defeated 3 of the 4 great martial kings. Barros responds that it was all thanks to the protagonist's necromancy, because martial power isn't just about experience. He gives the example that excellent swordsmanship is useless to a person without an arm. Barros says that maybe it would be possible if he trained well for 6 months, but in 1 month it's impossible. Karnak gets angry and tells him to stop eating, taking the food out of his hand. Barros tells him to stop being stingy with the food. He suggests to the protagonist that he find someone from the house's knightly order. The protagonist asks if he really believes they would be in this situation if they had such a good fighter. Karnak says this leaves only one option. He will have to use necromancy. Barros comments that now he understands why his master learned necromancy. However, the protagonist points out a small problem. If they use necromancy, they will be discovered, as it is a forbidden art. Karnak asks Barros if he remembers the first time they fled. People were searching for them, shouting that the blessing of Alium would be with whoever found that demon. The protagonist recalls that they secretly took care of the household members with necromancy, but the priests of Alium accused the protagonist of being guilty. The soldiers finally cornered them, calling them demons. They were certain that Karnak was a necromancer. Seeing that there was no way out, the protagonist begins to chant, "Come, wandering vengeful spirits. Extinguish the fate of the living with the light of the abyss." Several souls begin to appear called vengeful wraith spirits. The soldiers start shouting that he was using necromancy and manipulating an evil spirit. They prepare themselves, and as the spirits advance, the soldiers use talismans. The talisman is a sacred relic of the Ilium order, capable of subduing evil energy. However, this wasn't enough. The spirits begin to attack everyone there, and they scream that the goddess's blessing wasn't working. The protagonist continues controlling the spirits and ordering them to attack the soldiers. In no time, all of them were dead. Karnak says they need to run because the next group would soon catch up to them. The protagonist wonders how the priests detected the necromancy, since the book said necromancy would be undetectable. Barros starts reading the book and explains that this only works on common people, like knights and mages. Apparently, clerics are an exception. The protagonist is shocked to learn this. Returning to the present, Barros starts laughing, saying that was really a problem back then. The protagonist comments that it was the beginning of the legend. Barros says he can guess what the plan was, thinking about the past. Karnak sighs, saying he must have tried to use necromancy secretly, pretending it was a normal fight. However, the judges of a trial by combat are priests, who are clerics. The past will just repeat itself if he uses necromancy there, but he emphasizes that he doesn't want to be hunted down again like last time. Barros suggests they take the money and flee secretly. He volunteers to find out where the jewels and the domain's funds are kept. Karnak asks if that wouldn't be a waste, since all the useless family members were dead and all the residents liked him. Barros comments that it seems Karnak wants to continue acting as a good patriarch and tells the protagonist to do as he pleases, but he'll go ahead and prepare for his funeral. The protagonist says that doesn't sound very encouraging to hear, and asks Barros to wait a moment and sit down again. Karnak comments that it's not very safe, but he has a great idea. In the fortress north of Deventor, training was underway. The instructor orders everyone to stop, as they'll take a short break before continuing. While everyone is exhausted and crying from the heavy training, Randolph stands among them. Suddenly, someone arrives and asks if the preparations for the trial by combat were going well. Randolph looks at Bright and asks what he needs to prepare against an abandoned nerd. Bright agrees, but comments that carelessness is a sin, suggesting that maybe the protagonist has some plan. Randolph starts mocking, saying that Bright is worrying too much. Bright thinks it's impossible for Randolph to lose, but he still wonders why the new Lord of Zestrad challenged them to a duel. Suddenly, he hears some voices and turns around, seeing several people, with a man crouching down. He asks if that guy is another traveling merchant, noting that it's strange since many have been showing up lately. Bright turns away, saying it was distracting him, and then looks at all the warriors and orders them back to training. The merchant smiles. It was Barros, who says he's starting to get an idea of what's going on. He watches Randolph's training, thinking it was a good idea to come and take a look. As he sees Randolph training, he thinks that while Randolph may not be powerful in combat, in a one-on-one battle, his opponent actually has a chance of winning. Barros comments that Randolph is the type of dumb fighter who uses common heavy sword techniques. He hasn't even learned to use battle aura yet. It's easy to predict the movements of opponents like him. In any case, this is good for Barros, but even so, he thinks that at this rate, a month still won't be enough. Suddenly, a woman arrives and asks if he has something to discuss with her brother since he's been staring at him for a while. Barros turns around, smiling, and asks if she is Randolph's sister. The woman responds that she is, and asks if he has something to settle with him. Barros says that he was influenced by the vigor of the strongest knight in the north, but in his mind, he thinks that Randolph is a complete idiot. He offers her some handkerchiefs, asking if she likes any of them, and mentions that he could give her a special price. She approaches Barros and points to one of the handkerchiefs, saying that it's very beautiful. He starts laughing, saying that she has great taste, while wondering if she had noticed anything. Sometime later, in the personal training room of the Jestard family, Barros arrives, informing the protagonist that he's back and asking how his training is going. As soon as Barros looks ahead, he sees the protagonist nearly passed out on the ground. He rushes to the protagonist and starts shaking him, yelling for him to wake up. Karnak asks him to stop shaking him like that, or he's going to die for real. Barros asks the protagonist if he completed the 50 laps around the field as he said he would. The protagonist, still trembling, responds that he just finished and passed out. He can't run anymore. Barros comments that this is a serious lack of energy. Karnak gets angry and asks why he was training like that in the first place. Barros says that the protagonist can't do anything with that stick-thin body of his, so he should keep trembling and nearly dying. The protagonist says he needs to rest a little first. Barros stands up and goes to the protagonist, asking what this word rest is, because now they're going to start the real training. The protagonist is startled, asking what he had been doing until now if it wasn't the real training. Barros responds that it was just the warm-up. With a frightening smile, Barros says they should begin the training now, 20 days until the duel. First, he should make sure to have a good breakfast, then they should go to the field and do 100 push-ups. Afterward, to compensate, they should do 100 staff swings, 100 squats, and right after, trembling, the protagonist asks if they'll rest. Barros responds that they can rest a bit, but after the rest, they'll have another meal, more push-ups, staff swings again, more squats, and then another rest. This was repeated several times throughout the day. After 5 days, the protagonist was already exhausted, but he was still having some difficulties. Barros comes up to him, saying that finally, Karnak has shown some improvement. The protagonist agrees, saying he's been training hard, but still can't compare to Barros. He comments that it's because Barros trained twice as much as he's been training. Barros grabs a sword and says it's time to start swordsmanship training. The protagonist throws the bags on the ground and says that the time has finally come. Barros hands the sword to him. Just by seeing Karnak holding the sword, Barros comments that it was horrifying. He starts circling the protagonist, saying that his arms are trembling, asking where the protagonist is looking, and explaining that he should relax his shoulders, distribute his weight, bend his knees more, and steady his arms. They begin training, and Barros makes the protagonist repeat the same movement several times. Karnak is exhausted, thinking that Barros is very demanding. Barros comments that if the protagonist keeps improving like this, he won't lose his head in the first attack. He tells the protagonist to get ready because he's going to attack him now. Karnak smiles, saying he'll control himself. Barros strikes so hard that he hits the protagonist very quickly. He prepares to attack again and asks what the protagonist is doing, telling him to assume his position again. The protagonist keeps getting beaten, thinking that Barros's barrage of attacks makes it difficult to counterattack. So all he can do is stay in position. Suddenly, one of Barros's attacks hits his stomach so hard that the protagonist cries out in pain and falls to the ground with a thud. Barros comments that this is why knights can have a field day against civilians, emphasizing that knights don't give the opponent a chance to counterattack. He says that the protagonist should stay in position and dodge the attacks. Karnak responds that he already knows that, but even while staying in position, he can't dodge the next attack. Barros explains that this is obvious because the purpose of that training is to show Randolph the protagonist's determination to fight. Karnak asks if he will have to do this during the duel. Barros says that Randolph has a habit of wanting to show off, so he will try to display his skills to the spectators by toying with his opponent. However, this changes if the opponent loses the will to fight. A draw would harm Randolph's honor, so he will try to win at all costs. Barros says that's why the protagonist must show him that he won't give up no matter what. Barros says that the protagonist must do this if he doesn't want to die right at the beginning. 5 days before the duel, Karnak was different. He was confident and attacked Barros, who kept correcting the protagonist's posture and movements. Barros strikes him and yells louder. Suddenly, another attack comes as a surprise, catching the protagonist off guard. Barros yells at him to make sure he's being heard. With a quick move, the protagonist manages to defend himself, but Barros's attack is so strong that it throws him away, causing him to fall to the ground and slide until he hits the wall. Barros scolds him, saying he can't be hit at all. Otherwise, he'd be turned into sushi. He tells the protagonist that he must always roll on the ground. Completely worn out, Karnak thinks this would be shameful. 4 days before the duel, the protagonist manages to roll on the ground, though he was crying due to Barros's strength. 3 days before the duel, Karnak was like a Beyblade, rolling all over the place while dodging attacks. 2 days before the duel, the protagonist was already rolling in a different way, managing to get up quickly. The training was so intense that the protagonist comments that at this rate, he would end up dying before the duel even started. Barros approaches him and says he's doing very well, highlighting that he's almost ready. Barros stands in front of him and asks if they should continue training. The two stare at each other, and Barros says he's going to teach him the swordsmanship of the 4 martial kings. The protagonist is surprised and asks if Barros really knew about such things. Barros sighs and says yes, he knew everything. He begins to explain that the 4 martial kings were all his apprentices. He emphasizes that he learned all the techniques, except for Queen Rapunzel's. The protagonist asks why he didn't learn her technique. Barros responds that he didn't learn it because the protagonist didn't turn her into a death knight. She resisted until the end. So the protagonist reduced her to pieces and turned her into a guard. Karnak remembers this and comments that it was very evil of him. Barros says that doesn't matter and states that what the protagonist is going to learn now is the Defiade sword technique from the martial king Levin. Karnak asks if he could really learn that in 2 days, since it's the technique of a martial king. Barros asks why he wants 2 days if they'll only need 1. Finally, the day of the duel arrived, on the border between Devontor and Gestard. People were gathering and talking. One young man asks another who he thinks will win, and they say that, without a doubt, it will be Randolph. On the other side, people from the Zestrat house wondered if the protagonist could really win. Some said he had been training hard day after day, so they should trust him. The decisive moment finally arrived. Karnak approaches, confident, accompanied by his trainer and aide, Barros. People start gathering around the arena. A person approaches and strikes their staff, asking everyone to be silent in the presence of Alium. He says that both houses claimed ownership of the copper mines and thus requested a trial. The ownership of the mine will be decided through a duel. Karnak, from the Gestard house, must step forward and face the goddess. Randolph, from Devontor, must also step forward and face the goddess. The man informs that before the fight, according to the rules, a restriction was applied to the equipment based on the fighter's abilities. He asks both, in the name of Alium, if they swear to fight honorably. Both swear. The man announces that the oath has been made, and now the scales of justice must seek the truth. He shouts, starting the trial by combat. The two stare at each other, and everyone begins to pay attention. Randolph comments that he admired the protagonist's courage for not running away, but that it didn't change anything. He begins to attack, and the protagonist defends himself with his shield. Smiling, Karnak says they'll only know after trying. The protagonist attacks, but Randolph retreats, admitting that the protagonist really wasn't all talk. Randolph keeps attacking, but the protagonist defends himself from all the blows he receives. People cheer, saying that the protagonist was having a decent fight. Barros watches in silence, commenting that the beginning was going as expected. Neither too fast nor threatening, Randolph was just studying his opponent. Karnak thinks he should stick with what he trained. Now he should show his will to fight. The protagonist stops and starts yelling, calling Randolph to the fight. Randolph looks at the protagonist and notices that his eyes are full of determination. He lacks skill, but he has spirit. Randolph prepares to attack, saying it's time to increase the difficulty. The protagonist notices that Randolph's sword energy has increased and realizes he won't be able to block that attack with his shield. Randolph continues his attack, causing a great impact in the arena, but the protagonist starts rolling, as trained, dodging the blows. Randolph is confused by this, wondering what kind of crude skill that was. The people start to get excited, saying that their lord was truly skillful. They comment that, although strange, the method was effective, but they had never seen anything like it before. Karnak throws the shield away and says that Randolph is nothing, that he didn't even need the shield. The protagonist begins to mock, calling Randolph so slow that he mistook him for a turtle. Karnak asks if a muscle-bound pig like Randolph was really a knight. Randolph, very irritated, curses the protagonist and asks if Karnak is really going to keep mocking him, because if so, he will make sure the protagonist never speaks again. Karnak prepares and smiles, telling Randolph to try his worst. Randolph is confused by this, but, full of rage, notices the protagonist's stance and realizes it's the Delphiad sword technique. The people begin to comment on the protagonist's stance, saying it was created by the martial king Lavoon, one of the 4 martial kings. They become happy, believing that their lord trained with the techniques of the martial kings. Randolph thinks he almost fell for the protagonist's trick and realizes he needs to calm down and focus on the fight. The sword techniques of the martial kings can only be used by geniuses with real battle experience, and he believes the protagonist is far from capable of using them properly. Randolph wonders how that idiot managed to learn that technique, but acknowledges that learning it is indeed difficult, praising the protagonist's effort. Randolph points his sword at the protagonist and declares that since Karnak is the new lord of the Jestard state, he will act justly in Aleum's name. He thinks the protagonist can't defeat him. Karnak becomes worried by Randolph's gaze, believing it will be enough to finish him off. The protagonist recalls the conversation he had with Barros. He asks Barros if he really thinks it's possible to learn the martial king's technique. Barros replies that he barely needs to copy it. The protagonist still worries about this, but Barros says that the protagonist won't have to pick up the sword again once everything is over. Therefore, he only needs to show enough skill for people to believe he was training, because their real plan is something else. Returning to the fight, Karnak is getting beaten up, thinking he wasn't warned that he'd go through this. He starts defending the attacks, thinking that he still needs to do what needs to be done, even while crying. The protagonist yells that this is nothing, and asks if Randolph really thought it would be enough to defeat the Jestard house lineage. Randolph wonders what the protagonist is talking about since he's getting beaten like crazy. The protagonist shouts that the Jestard sword will never fall. The people become emotional with the protagonist's determination and wonder if they really thought he was just a clown. The protagonist yells, asking if Randolph was scared. People start getting emotional, crying, and saying that even if the protagonist is an idiot, he is a great lord. Barros watches the fight, smiling, and thinks that Karnak isn't receiving any direct hits. It seems that spending almost 30 days beating him up was worth it. Karnak keeps getting beaten and calls Randolph a worthless knight, daring him to come at him. Barros thinks that his lord has always had a talent for talking nonsense. Extremely irritated, Randolph thinks he's tired of continuing this. He looks at the protagonist and says that he's barely holding on, asking what he was talking about, but the protagonist keeps calling Randolph to fight. Randolph unleashes his power and charges forward with impressive speed, yelling that it's time to end this. Barros sees this and becomes anxious, thinking that the moment has finally arrived. He shouts, telling the protagonist to be careful. With that, Karnak wonders if it's time. He remembers Barros emphasizing that even if he manages to mimic the movements without a real attack, everyone will see it as just a trick. That's why Barros explained exactly what the protagonist would have to do. Barros had said that, at the end of the fight, Randolph would attack the protagonist's legs to limit his movements. At the right moment, the protagonist should switch to a defensive stance, and with that, throw his opponent to the ground. Randolph comes in full force, and the protagonist manages to block the attack. Randolph is impressed, wondering how an amateur blocked that. Barros had instructed that, after blocking the attack, the protagonist should swing his sword upward in a diagonal arc. The protagonist does exactly that, striking Randolph's sword. Barros had said that after this move, the protagonist should change his sword grip and attack once more. With Randolph's guard open thanks to the protagonist's first move, he is struck by the second attack. This attack is called the double killer uppercut. Blood begins to drip on the arena floor, and Karnak sighs, exhausted. Randolph starts to laugh with a small cut on his chest and asks if that was all the protagonist had. He comments that a cat would hurt more than that attack. Karnak sees this and thinks the situation is not looking good. He stares at Randolph, wondering if this would be the end. The people begin to comment that the fight already seemed decided. They say that miracles don't exist and that reality is cruel. Randolph says the protagonist let his guard down and that his friends would laugh at him. The protagonist responds that he's risking his life there, and all Randolph has to say now is worry. Suddenly, the protagonist starts laughing strangely and comments that the situation isn't so bad, so he doesn't need to feel bad for Randolph. The wound on Randolph's chest starts to emanate a strange aura, and he becomes confused by the protagonist's expression. As soon as he realizes what's happening to his chest, a powerful aura begins to emerge, making him scream in pain and wonder what it is. The soldiers prepare, and the judge watches the situation, concerned, wondering if that aura was. Randolph tries to fight against the aura, and Karnak seizes the opportunity to advance quickly, shouting that no matter how many dirty tricks Randolph has, he won't lose in any way. The aura paralyzes Randolph's leg, and the protagonist approaches. At the last second, Randolph manages to move and lands a kick so strong on the protagonist that it launches him out of the arena, destroying the ground as he passes. The people start looking at Randolph, wondering how a human could have such strength. They wonder if that black aura was being controlled. Suddenly, Barros shouts that it was necromancy, that it must be demonic power. The judge orders the soldiers to rush in and defeat Randolph. They all charge forward, shouting for Randolph to stop that evil. The judge yells in the name of Alium to bring judgment and justice against impure beings. He must drop that sword and surrender. Randolph yells, asking what the hell they're talking about, and attacks everyone at once with the aura. The soldiers, along with the judge, are thrown outside the arena. The judge says it's definitely necromancy, and they need to stop him immediately. Randolph loses control and wonders what's happening to his body. He wonders what Karnak did to him. Outside, the protagonist smiles, thinking that it seems Randolph was confused, but even so, he shouldn't be making such a scene. The protagonist snaps his fingers, and the aura begins to bind Randolph. A soldier comments that it looks like Randolph is being controlled by the curse. The judge says that this is happening because he still doesn't know how to control it properly, and unfortunately they have no other choice. They need to kill Randolph at the first opportunity. The aura starts to consume him entirely while he screams. The soldiers, along with the judge, advance. Randolph begins to cry, knowing there was nothing more he could do. Suddenly, he is struck by multiple swords and spears, screaming in pain. He starts bleeding as he screams, and after being hit by all of that, the aura begins to disappear. He falls to the ground, dead. The soldiers confirm that he is no longer breathing and ask what they should do. The judge orders them to send officials to the Viscount's estate to investigate everything. The judge declares that a verdict has been reached. The fighter from Devontor invoked a dark power and dueled in this sacred trial. He emphasizes that this was a disgrace to the name of the goddess, and thus, the fighter from Gestard, Baron Karnak, is the winner. Meanwhile, at the Viscount's estate, they found things like blankets and cloaks with necromancy symbols. There was evidence all over the property. Randolph's sister says she can't believe it because all those things were items she had recently bought from a traveling vendor. One of the soldiers raises a suspicious bottle of medicine that was found in Randolph's room and asks her what it means. She, startled, says it's just a hair tonic they bought from a growth formula merchant. She emphasizes that her brother was always concerned about hair loss. The soldiers declare that these are clear evidence of necromancy and inform her that a hearing will be held soon, leaving the lady completely terrified. A few days later at the Gestard estate, the table was full of food, and the protagonist asks what Barros thought of the table, if it wasn't a table worthy of champions. Barros says it's all incredible, compared to the food he ate while training, and that he gets chills just eating it. The two of them eat like crazy. The protagonist says that this is to celebrate the victory, and Barros asks if it's right for them to eat so much. The protagonist responds that he's sure there's a banquet going on in the town square as well. Barros asks how the protagonist managed to come up with a spell like that. Karnak explains that he had to do anything to win, but it only worked well because of Randolph's explosive personality. A month ago, Barros was irritated, asking if the protagonist was really going to use necromancy. He asks if he's the only one taking this seriously. Karnak asks him to listen to what the protagonist had to say first. Karnak says that if he dies being caught using necromancy or during the duel, it's the same thing. Therefore, he says it's better to use it right away. He asks if, thinking that way, it doesn't seem right. The protagonist smiles and says there's a surprise in all of this. The one who would use necromancy wouldn't be him, but Randolph. Barros is confused and asks what the protagonist is thinking. Karnak says he would have to pretend to be an idiot, and that's his specialty. With the officials so far away, he believes he can fool everyone in a situation where they're fighting, as it will be hard to tell who's using the spell. He explains that it's a strong, high-level necromancy spell, so even the Order won't suspect that it was the protagonist who used it. Barros hears all this and says that it seems there's nothing to worry about. The protagonist comments that there was only one problem though. If he wants to do this, he'll need Randolph to spill some blood. The protagonist's concern is that, with his current sword skills, which are terrible, he doesn't know if he'll be able to cut Randolph's body. It was at that moment that Barros smiled and asked if all the protagonist needed was to make his opponent bleed. He asks where the protagonist wants the cut. After the training, the protagonist says that he feels nearly dead again, emphasizing that Barros is worse than the devil. Barros, smiling, asks if it wasn't worth the effort to push so hard. Barros then comments that there's still something strange, as Randolph should have won even without necromancy. He says that they managed to escape any suspicion, and that all they did was conduct an investigation against the Deventor family. The protagonist explains that the investigators who Randolph used were convinced it was necromancy. Barros asks why. In the Great Gezelan Temple, within the Order of Allium, a man was asking the judge if he had just finished investigating the dark powers of the Deventor family. The man comments that this is a serious problem, and that the judge should report only confirmed facts. The judge responds that, based on their experience and investigation, he was certain of what he was saying. This was not the work of just any necromancer. He takes out a vial and shows it, saying that, using the transcendent fragment, the goddess warned that the properties matched. This was the darkness of the apocalypse. The protagonist smiles, saying that it seems luck was on his side in this life. They celebrate, saying that all they need to do is make the most of it. As they walk, Barros comments that with the Deventor family destroyed, various powers will try to seize the mines. The protagonist agrees, and says that's why he needs to become stronger. Barros asks what will happen if the Order discovers this. Karnak responds that this is why he needs to figure out how to use necromancy without getting caught. 3 months later inside his mansion, the protagonist was training and thinks that he needs to focus. Negative energy of the moonlight, darkness of the deep night, I invoke the corrupted energy, filter it, and collect only the pure energy behind it. A ball of energy forms in his hand. Finally, he separates and reprocesses it to create magic. The shape of the ball changes, and he shouts that it worked. This is chaos magic. 3 months later, inside his mansion, the protagonist was training. He thinks that it has been 3 months of training, and he still doesn't see a path to becoming a knight of Jestard. He believes the problem is that the knight's skills are pathetic. He was training with Jestard's senior soldier named Gilliman. He thinks they've had support all this time, so there was no avoiding it. Gilliman shouts for them to stop. Nearly exhausted, Gilliman says they should end the training there. Barros approaches him and thanks him for today's training. Gilliman says that's a bit embarrassing since he's the one learning there. He emphasizes that Barros is improving incredibly fast and will soon become the strongest knight in Jestard. Barros replies that there's still a long way to go. Gilliman remarks that he's very modest and invites him for a drink. Barros says he can't, as he was sent on a mission by the protagonist. They say their goodbyes there. Inside the mansion, Barros arrives shouting, "Protagonist, it's time for snack time." Karnak throws a fireball at Barros, who dodges it, screaming. The protagonist, irritated, says that was dangerous and tells Barros to knock before entering. Trembling, Barros asks, "What technique is that? It didn't seem like necromancy." Karnak responds that Barros is sharp and says it's hard to consider it necromancy. He begins to release the energy, saying that it's very similar to mana. Barros mentions that the protagonist just can't use mana and asks if he's switching powers. There are 4 ways to transcend human strength in that world: Knight's battle aura, Mage's mana, Divinity for clerics, and Necromancy that deals with death and darkness. This transcendent force only accumulates the energy that is appropriate for your body, and once this force is accumulated, it transforms into power, as the power is optimized to best suit the user's body and soul. You can't use another power once your soul has already been given to another, Barros says, explaining that the protagonist cannot switch his power. Karnak responds that he didn't switch it, as he's only in the 2nd stage. Barros asks if his power would change in the 2nd stage. Karnak explains that necromancy, which uses death energy and corrupted energy, is literally a very dirty form of mana. That's why he managed it so well, since he had quite a rotten upbringing. He compares it to certain foods that use unpleasant methods, like fermented food. This power was also processed not to seem raw or dirty. He says he filtered out negative energies like hatred and resentment, leaving only the pure energy of death and darkness. Then, by transforming it into mana, that's how his chaotic mana was completed. By appearance, it looks just like regular mana. The protagonist says that's the name he gave it. Barros looks at him and asks if he was asked. He then admits that it does indeed resemble mana. The protagonist remarks that it's fine for him to pretend to be a mage. Barros becomes concerned and asks if the protagonist can have the same strength he had in his past life. Karnak replies that with great power comes great responsibility. All he needs now is enough power to protect the territory, the western forest of Jestard's domain. Gilliman mentions that they've already dealt with all the monsters there. He says everyone did a good job, so they should head back. He mentions that he'll write a report. However, another monster suddenly appears behind him and attacks. The soldiers shout for him to be careful. As soon as he turns around, it's too late for him to escape. Without hesitation, Barros leaps and kills the monster, which falls to the ground. Barros says he's late and asks Gilliman if he's all right. Gilliman thanks him, saying he feels safer now with an official knight. Barros comments that it hasn't been long since he became a knight, so he finds it a bit strange and embarrassing. He then asks Gilliman if the monsters have been acting strange. Gilliman replies that they have, noting that the Snarls are twice as strong, so he believes the rumor is true. Barros asks what rumor. Gilliman speaks of the goddess's oracle, the oracle of destruction, which the 7 gods who protect the world and humanity sent to the Order. The void will open its mouth and vomit out a fate that is not allowed. This will be a darkness that extinguishes the light, a darkness that gathers lives. At that time, hardships will arise, wrong beasts will gain wrong powers, and the dead will awaken and walk upon the wrong lands. The king of the dead will descend and paint the world with blood and tears. He will be the end that speaks of destruction. After the goddess's oracle, creatures from another continent will emerge, and necromancers will become uncontrollable, causing disasters wherever they go. The religious orders of the continent announced an oracle to prevent chaos. They began fighting against them under the goddess's blessing to protect the world. Barros recounts this entire story to the protagonist and comments that this oracle didn't exist before they returned. He asks why the past keeps changing. Karnak says he's nervous about not having information on this. Barros notes that the rumors are exactly about them and asks the protagonist if he thinks it has something to do with him. Karnak says the timeline doesn't align, as the oracle occurred before he returned to the past. Barros observes that's why the incident with Randolph happened so easily. He questions if the world is collapsing and if they should do something. The protagonist responds by asking what they, mere country bastards, could do. He says he doesn't know who the current king of the dead is or how he's destroying the world so easily. Barros comments that humans have many heroes and questions whether they won't figure it out on their own. The protagonist says they should trust in the strength of that world and that they only need to stay in their territory and enjoy life. 7 days later, a young man appears, saying he's from the Order of the Sun Goddess, Latiel. He's come to ask for their help. The two think they are in trouble. The young man explains that they discovered an active necromancer in the city of Durarth, who has fled to Gestard. He emphasizes that they believe the necromancer is hiding near the forest and would like to request a guide who knows the area. Barros becomes apprehensive, glancing at the protagonist, wondering if his master was also sensing something strange. He thinks they need to decline this request in the most natural way possible. The protagonist sets his cup down on the table and smiles, asking how they could refuse matters concerning the goddess. Barros is confused, wondering what Karnak is up to. The protagonist says he will send someone urgently. The young man thanks them for their cooperation. As soon as the young man leaves, Barros, irritated, looks at the protagonist and says he thought they weren't going to interfere in the world's affairs. Karnak responds that this is a good opportunity for them to better understand what's happening. Barros asks what the protagonist plans to do. Releasing a frightening aura and with a terrifying smile, the protagonist says he's going to capture the necromancer and then ruin his life, emphasizing that he'll show these modern trash what a real necromancer is. Meanwhile, in the forest, a man is running, thinking he managed to shake off everyone. As he runs, he curses those goddess dogs. He thinks that he was finally going to stop living like a vagrant, but immediately they started chasing him again. He vows to do whatever it takes to survive and then get revenge on each one of them. Suddenly, several energy balls appear, illuminating the man. The soldiers have surrounded him, shouting that it's the end and ordering him to stop, calling him a demon. The man shouts, saying he really thought it would be easy to escape, but realizes it was a trap. The soldiers declare they won't tolerate any more disturbances from him and order him to surrender. He begins using his magic and asks if they really think he would give himself up like that. The man starts screaming intensely, and his aura grows stronger. A specter appears, frightening the soldiers. Their leader orders them to remove the protective charms, but the man controls the spirit and attacks all of them. Karnak observes and comments that it's driving him crazy because it's quite a scene. The protagonist is furious because the man's technique and words are all wrong. Barros, disheartened, comments that the guy didn't even learn the basics. He says they should start right away. As soon as Barros says this, he notices that the man has started running again. The protagonist says it's time to act, as they need to reach him before the soldiers capture him. The man, running through the forest, finds a cave and enters, remarking that he's spent more power than he expected. He realizes he needs to hide for a while, but soon starts feeling warmth around him and thinks lighting a fire would help him warm up better. However, when he looks ahead, he finds the protagonist and Barros sitting around a campfire. Barros, relieved, comments that the man has finally arrived, mentioning that they were worried and asking why he took so long. Karnak then says that the man has a good eye since that's their usual hideout, and Barros asks if it's the first time he's come there. The man, frightened, asks who they are, and the protagonist questions what he's talking about. The man mentions that there were people after him while observing the two, pondering how they dared provoke him. Deciding to defend himself, he begins using his magic again, summoning his servants, and the specters start appearing. The man tries to escape, believing the specters could buy him some time. He thinks it's their fault for provoking the situation. Barros feigns concern, noting that the number of specters is too large to be cut down with a sword, and comments that the man is really putting in an effort. The protagonist, impatient, tells Barros to shut up, while Karnak smiles and begins releasing his energy, expressing his desire to test the chaotic mana. Outside the cave, the man keeps running, believing that the two would be occupied for a long time, until he hears a deafening noise. The protagonist was blowing everything up around him, destroying the cave and launching the specters away. Frightened, the man wonders what's happening and soon sees the two emerging from the cave. The protagonist, with just a flick of 2 fingers, creates several energy balls that hit all the specters simultaneously, creating holes in the ground. Surprised, the man asks if the protagonist is a mage, realizing that he's much stronger than he initially thought. Facing the possibility of being captured, the man sees no other option and screams that he will show the true power of death. A different spirit, a malevolent spirit, appears. Barros watches and comments on how young people seem to have a lot of energy these days, while the protagonist questions why that man is calling it a malevolent spirit, since to him it looks like just a common specter. Laughing, the man says he can see the fear on their faces, but the protagonist, indignant, asks if he's serious. The man declares that it's too late to beg for their lives and commands the specter to attack. As the specter charges toward the protagonist, Karnak, irritated, orders it to kneel. Immediately the specter drops to the ground, kneeling and bowing, trembling in fear before the true king of death. Confused, the man asks if the protagonist is a necromancer, and Karnak, with sarcasm, says he was very slow to realize that. Stomping hard on the specter's head, Karnak asks the man who he thinks he's dealing with. Suddenly, the protagonist's aura changes color, turning green. Karnak then explains that the man has no idea what this is, calling it deviation. A gigantic hand appears over the man, and the protagonist, revealing his specialty, makes the giant hand grab him, crushing him mercilessly. After the fight, the protagonist uses his magic on the man and orders him to stand up. The man rises, saying, "Yes, master." Karnak asks how he acquired the powers of necromancy. The boy begins to explain that it was just by luck. He was drowning his sorrows on the streets as usual, when suddenly the darkness of an alley began to envelop him. He tells them that an unknown power began to surge through his body, and that he realized it was the authority of the apocalypse, as the prophecy said. With so much power available, he didn't hesitate for a second, emphasizing that using those powers was easy, and with that, he became incredibly strong in no time. The boy continues saying that he used that power to kill all the people he disliked and then infiltrated a mansion. The protagonist interrupts him, telling him to stop talking. Karnak comments that this man is a nobody, and Barros asks the protagonist if he wanted to control the man's mind, as he already had his own dagger. Karnak answers yes, because they needed to clean that up. A scream is heard, and blood falls to the floor. They put the dagger in the man's hand. The protagonist bends down and begins to use his powers. Barros, surprised, asks why he would absorb the man's powers if he wanted to avoid dirty energies. Karnak explains that he needs to investigate this further, and, moreover, a search group will arrive there soon, so he will take just a little to avoid suspicion. As he absorbs the man's powers, he notices something strange. Barros notices and asks if the protagonist is all right. They hear distant voices shouting that the noise came from there, and that they should search in that direction. Karnak comments that there's something strange about this, and, turning around, says that the people are already there. A few days later at the protagonist's mansion, an energy barrier begins to form. Barros asks if it is really so serious that they need to erect a soundproof barrier. The protagonist responds that this is not something common, and highlights that he examined more closely the power he collected the other day. Barros asks if he found something in the apocalypse darkness. Karnak replies yes, and says that he himself is the cause of it. Barros is completely lost, and asks how that makes sense with the timeline. The protagonist says he also has no idea, but affirms that what he collected matches perfectly with his own powers, so it is definitely him. Barros remains confused and asks how that can be. Karnak asks if he knows why they chose regression instead of possession. Barros answers that it's because the bodies they would possess couldn't handle the spiritual power they have. The protagonist agrees and explains that's exactly it. They have too much power and tried to squeeze into bodies that couldn't handle it. So they abandoned much of their powers and separated just the souls. With this, they could return to their original bodies. All of this to increase the chances of success. The protagonist comments that the problem is that he might not have left his power in the future. He explains that he left his body alive and used the energy to create the Estra Schnapf, becoming something that was neither body nor spirit. Karnak says that he thinks their powers were linked to his spirit and not to his body, and as such, his powers crossed into the past along with his soul. However, his younger body couldn't handle it and released most of the power. Barros, incredulous, asks if his powers really came to the past. Karnak confirms, emphasizing that this left energy became the darkness of the apocalypse. Barros slaps his forehead, saying that the protagonist was so strong that even a part of his power scattered around the world is enough to destroy that world completely. He comments that this life is over. He then asks if there is still any hope. Barros has a great idea and suggests to the protagonist that he simply call his powers back, questioning if they would obey his command. Karnak looks at him and asks if, by throwing coins on the street and calling them back, they would return. Barros, annoyed, shouts that they were screwed because of the protagonist. Karnak replies that trusting the world is pointless. He already tried to screw the world over once. The protagonist states that the answer is simple. They need to do something. However, he remembers himself and all his power and begins to tremble. Barros, disheartened, comments that he thought this life would be easy. He asks what the protagonist wants to do, and Karnak says they need to investigate the other darknesses of the end. Barros sighs, saying they are back to living like beggars. Karnak promises to ensure he is well fed, as he didn't want to do this either. The next day, they begin to ride horses, commenting that leaving there doesn't seem so bad after all. Barros smiles and says it's because they are not being pursued, and the protagonist recalls that they faced many troubles before. Barros adds that there are no bandits nearby, since they used to bother them every time. Karnak mentions that now they have some backing so the bandits wouldn't dare mess with them. Barros agrees, saying that having money is great. He highlights that they left the mansion saying they were going to do magic training and that they are heading to Durarth. The protagonist confirms, explaining that it was from there that the necromancer they captured got his powers, so there must be some clue there. Barros comments that this still seems a bit improvised, as the apocalypse darkness wouldn't just walk up to them. He asks if the protagonist has any tracking magic or something similar. Karnak responds that no, emphasizing that they will have to do it the old-fashioned way. The protagonist asks if Barros remembers where they went at that time. As soon as they enter the city, they head straight for the Durarth, the Adventurers Guild. The two stop in front while the protagonist comments that this is the best place to get information, emphasizing that they have all kinds of information available. Barros mentions that, in the past, they managed to forge their identities as adventurers, and now, once again, they prove useful to them. The protagonist says that, although in the past they were sought after by many people and quite often, they still were of great help. Karnak goes to the door and comments that things would be different now, as they had no reasons to become adventurers. They enter and go straight to the counter. The protagonist hands a bag full of coins to the receptionist, who becomes very happy and welcomes the two, asking if they need information related to the apocalypse darkness. Barros asks how their god could remain silent when there were monsters on the earth. The protagonist asks the man to tell them the smallest details. The receptionist goes to the shelf, saying that they recently received several requests related to the apocalypse darkness, and therefore managed to gather a lot of information on the subject. He places a pile of reports on the counter and says that to start, they should take a look at those. The two are surprised to see so many documents. Without wasting time, they start looking through all the papers. Barros, examining the papers, lowers his head and comments that there is a lot of false information there. They put the papers on the table and comment that one of them involves a fraud. Another reports that a dog ate a chicken, and even a woman who fled her abusive husband was accused of being the apocalypse darkness. The receptionist observes that there seems to be a lot of false information and asks if the protagonist wants him to separate what is false. However, the protagonist says no, that he wanted everything the man had. The more details, the better. He says they need more. The protagonist touches Barros's shoulder and telepathically says, "As there are many people here, I will use the magic message." The magic message is a messaging system created by Karnak, which, using chaos magic, allows him to converse discreetly with Barros. The protagonist comments that sometimes relevant information is hidden among these useless documents. Barros sighs, saying that this is going to take a long time. Suddenly, they hear a person shouting, asking why no one believed him. The man was saying there was an evil necromancer in his village. Since no one believed him, he runs to the counter, saying he wanted to report an incident and complaining that no one believed him. The receptionist asks if a necromancer appeared in his village and if he had called the temple. Angrily, the man replies that even the temple doesn't believe him. The receptionist asks him to explain the situation. The man explains that some time ago, a foreigner named Cleo appeared in the village. As soon as he arrived, he transformed an abandoned mansion into his dwelling. He flirted with that pretty smile of his. The man says he didn't know where Cleo got his money from, being so young, but he often funded festivals to win the villagers' favor. He seduced all the young women in town with his strange abilities. The man shows a photo of his fiancée, saying that even she fell for the man. A group of men behind comment that the man's story is that a young, handsome, and rich guy is popular in his village, and ask if it really requires black magic for that. To them, he seems like a regular playboy. They tell the man he was exaggerating. The man becomes very upset about this, and the receptionist apologizes, explaining that he could not accept this report, and asking the man to understand. The receptionist asks if he would like to pay the fee to hire an adventurer and shows him the price. The man is shocked by the price, leaves the guild calling them mercenaries, and stating they would regret this. He slams the door, and the adventurers start commenting that the man is a fool and should be more careful with his jealousy. They say the man thought everyone would stop what they were doing to help him just because he mentioned necromancy. Karnak comments that they got nothing good today. Barros mentions that he heard of a good restaurant nearby and asks if the protagonist wants to eat there. The protagonist agrees, and the receptionist says he will contact them if something new comes up. Outside, Barros calls the protagonist and asks if that Cleo is suspicious. The protagonist responds that yes, questioning why Cleo would do all that in a random village instead of in a city, especially being rich and handsome. He says there's only one reason someone would want the innocent girls from the countryside. He wants the souls of virgins. The protagonist says it must be some kind of black magic and that they need to act quickly. After some time walking, they reach a village. Barros says it must be there and asks what the protagonist thinks. Karnak answers that he will show him. As soon as he snaps his fingers, magic begins to manifest. A barrier appears. Barros comments that it is very precise and that even a high-level priest would have trouble detecting it. He mentions that the necromancer must be very skilled, or it could be a simple barrier for him. Barros states that they need to confirm if the necromancer is involved with the apocalypse darkness. The protagonist suggests that maybe the necromancer is just an ordinary person. Suddenly, someone comes shouting towards the two. When they look, they see a priest waving at them. Both are concerned, questioning what he would be doing there. The priest introduces himself, saying his name is Alias, and that he is a rank 1 inquisitor of the Order of the Earth, serving Hatoba. They think this priest is high level. Barros says the man next to him is Baron Karnak of Jestard, and that he himself is a knight of the family, named Barros. He asks how they can help. The priest asks if they are adventurers and questions what brought them there. The protagonist replies that he heard some strange rumors while passing through, and therefore decided to investigate. The priest is pleased, and all excited, asks if they could do him a favor. He assures that it is for the goddess, and that it's nothing weird. Karnak even turns his face away from so much happiness. Barros asks what that favor would be. The priest explains that, although it is not certain, there is a chance that a necromancer is hiding in the village. The protagonist is surprised to learn that the Order knew about this. He comments that this is bad. Barros tries to play it cool and asks if the priest would like to join them. Alias sighs, saying that the Order will do nothing without concrete evidence due to the many false reports that have arisen. He emphasizes that they don't believe there is a necromancer there. Karnak asks if the situation isn't suspicious enough. Alias responds that it's a relative problem, because compared to the city, it's not hard to be considered rich and handsome in a village like that. People call anyone that, as long as they have a bit more money and are a bit more handsome. He comments that this is why he has been trying to solve the situation on his own. Alias looks at Barros, noting that he has a sword and slightly worn armor, a well-trained body, and that someone like him is not weak. The priest is pleased, and comments that people like them seem to be skilled, so he is sure that they would be of great help. This way, he could use his spells much more efficiently. The two look at the priest, and the protagonist telepathically says that this is annoying. He thinks there is no problem in accompanying him, since they also need to check some things. Alias wonders why they were standing still. Barros asks the protagonist what they would do if Alias discovered that the protagonist is also a necromancer. The protagonist smiles and says he would simply erase all of Alias's memories. Barros sighs, commenting that the protagonist is still evil, emphasizing that it's good to try to avoid that, as no one maintains their sanity after such an experience. The protagonist smiles and takes the priest's hand, saying that they would help, After all, they too were children of the goddess. Alias thanks them, wishing that the 7 goddesses bless them. Alias says he would take them to the town's church. First, they enter the town and go to the church. As soon as they arrive, the church leader named Graz and the nun named Julia welcome them, saying that this is the Church of the Wind. Graz says that Mr. Cleo has been a great help to the village, asserting that he has no involvement with necromancy. He says that a priest passed by earlier, but after a while he left. He says it's a pity they came all the way there for nothing. Alias smiles and says that it's fine. The fact that they came there for nothing means that no one is in danger, and that is a relief. Graz says that's true. He says that, unfortunately, they don't have much, but asks them to make themselves at home while they are there. He says he would take them to the rooms. Meanwhile, at Cleo's mansion, it was covered by a barrier. His butler informs him that a message from the village just arrived. It warned that another person from the order is there to investigate. Cleo asks him to inform him as soon as he notices anything strange. Annoyed, he says those roaches don't stop piling up. After the 3 are left in the room, they close the door, telling them to rest. The protagonist says that even the church leader has a positive opinion about Cleo. It seems that the entire town was deceived by that man. Alias agrees, saying that questioning people about this matter will be futile. Therefore, they need to meet him in person. The protagonist asks if he wanted to visit the mansion and question him personally. Alias asks for calm, saying there was a more effective way to do this. Smiling, he says the two just need to follow the plan. Night falls, and the mansion remains covered by a barrier. Cleo was walking around, and one of his maids notices that he was there. She asks where he was going at that hour. He says he is on his way to receive an unwelcome guest, but she should not worry about him. Cleo asks her to rest. She smiles and says she would see him tomorrow. He says the amulets worked very well. He cannot believe how weak the human mind is. As he walks, he thinks that it took him half a year to complete all the preparations to summon the demon. Then, it was time for his efforts to bear fruit, yet there was still one more obstacle. He thinks he is glad to have put up the detection barrier. He can talk to them, and then send them away. He opens the door thinking he has caught them. He looks at the 3 and asks what they were doing there. The 3 were robbing Cleo's house. He wonders who these people are. Barros begins to smile and says they were caught, asking if Cleo is the young master they had heard about. Alias says they heard he was giving money to the townspeople and asks if it was a problem if they took some too. Cleo begins to laugh, asking if they were thieves, saying he couldn't believe it because he was worried for nothing. Barros asks what Cleo was laughing about. The protagonist says it looks like they will need to slap him around. Suddenly, Cleo begins to use his magic, stating that the 3 were unworthy pieces of shit to be used as decent sacrifices. He unleashes his attack, and the words, "Oh Hatoba bless you," are heard. A barrier is created, defending them from the attacks. Cleo is worried to see this, as it was holy magic. They drop their disguises and say it was exactly as Alias had said. He points out that he didn't think Cleo was so foolish as to reveal his identity so easily. Alias says this is a proven method. Cleo is startled, thinking he was careless. He thinks he has no choice but to finish off the 3 right there. He begins to summon the undead from the underworld and orders them to attack the 3. Several undead begin to attack them. Without a second thought, the protagonist and Barros charge at them, while the priest says he would stay behind, buying them time with blessings. Barros quickly attacks all of them. The protagonist creates several magic missiles and hits the rest of the undead. Cleo sees that they are stronger than he thought and begins to use a spell. He knows it's too early to use it, but he has no other choice. A portal opens, and he says, "Appear, my beast from the underworld." A strong amount of energy starts to appear there, and a demon emerges before them. That was the demonic knight. Cleo begins to laugh, asking if they could defeat that. Alias strikes his staff on the ground and begins to say, "O light of Hatoba, purify the evil." He fires a blast of holy energy called Sacred Dispersion, which hits everyone there. Cleo asks if that is a counter-summoning. All summoned beings gather together, and a strong light begins to emerge from the ground. Cleo screams that this cannot be happening to him. Suddenly everyone is sent back. Cleo screams at seeing this. Alias says he already knew the type of magic he would try to use. With his eyes full of energy, Cleo admits he recognizes their strength, saying the 3 were not mere thieves. He begins to transform, stating he no longer needs to hide. A shadow starts to emerge on the ground. Cleo's entire body begins to change and crack as he screams. The ground starts to break, and he screams even more, releasing a gigantic amount of energy. He transforms into a monster. Alias is worried, thinking he did not expect this to happen. He won't have time to prepare another counter-summoning. As he thinks about getting out of there, Karnak and Barros advance without a second thought, smiling. Barros prepares to attack and cuts Cleo several times. The protagonist uses his magic missiles again, hitting him right in the chest. Cleo falls to the ground. unconscious. Alias is confused, unable to believe the strength the two showed. He wonders what just happened there. Karnak and Barros look at each other. The protagonist says that warmed them up a bit, while Barros says it was good training. Alias says the strength they showed is normal, but their teamwork is impeccable. There are no mistakes. Barros goes up to the priest and asks if they should kill Cleo or leave him there. Startled, Alias says he would take care of it. He begins to use his holy magic, and Cleo returns to normal. The cuts made by the sword were emanating dark magic. Alias collects this in a bottle, saying it's exactly what he imagined. It was the darkness of the end. He says all he needs to do now is purify the corridor, and then the protagonist strikes him, knocking him unconscious. Smiling, he says it's time for them to start working too. With both unconscious, Karnak and Barros sit down right there. Barros asks if the protagonist found anything interesting. Karnak says it seems that Cleo has always been a necromancer. What happened was that he absorbed some of the darkness of the end. Barros comments that it's tempting, as it's a great power, and asks if there's anything more. The protagonist says that apparently, Cleo was also part of a cult that worships Tesranik. Barros asks what that is, and the protagonist responds that apparently, this being is considered the god of death. Barros gets annoyed and asserts that Karnak is the god of death, and that not just anyone can hold such a title. The protagonist admits that he's also not sure about it. According to the cult's gospel, Tesranik is the god of death and rebirth. He is considered an entity that will purify the world through death and create a new paradise. Barros comments that these cultists, whatever their name, must be the reason for all this. He says they were believing in a god that doesn't even exist. Karnak agrees, saying that Barros is probably right, but those were the only good pieces of information he managed to get. He begins to channel magic into the bottle, saying there was one more thing. He explains that with the power of their priest friend, he could easily refine this chaos mana. Barros asks if that was why the protagonist wanted to visit the mansion with the priest. The protagonist answers yes, and explains that since chaos mana is purified and sealed necromancy power, if he could use divinity, it might facilitate the purification of chaos mana. Barros comments that the reason he wanted to help the priest was to test this reaction, saying it was fun to watch. The protagonist says that thanks to this, his mana has doubled, and he is now in the 4th magical circle. Barros comments that it seems they'll need to hunt some sacred artifacts. Karnak suggests that they could simply steal them from the church, but first, they need to wake up the priest. They start calling the priest, asking if he's okay. The next day, the priest was well and smiling. He says that apparently he let his guard down and got caught in such a silly trap, but he's very happy that the two were with him. The two were completely convinced by this performance. The protagonist comments that in the end everything turned out well, but the townspeople seem confused. Alias says the church would help and that the population would calm down. He asks where the two are headed next. Karnak answers that they will return to the city of Dirarth and rest, and they say goodbye there. The priest wishes that the blessing of Hatoba be with them. Barros asks the priest to take care in returning. As soon as they leave, the priest thinks that these two are not just nobodies, and that he already knows their identities, and that they could greatly help the castle. He decides to investigate as soon as he returns. The protagonist looks at Barros and comments that they should eat as soon as they get to the city. On the outskirts of the city of Dirarth, inside a house, some murmurs were heard. A person was being forced to talk. The man shouts that he is a necromancer and that he would tell everything about the power of darkness. He asks what the two wanted to know. The protagonist tells Barros to sink him one more time. Karnak says that all the bad energy was coming out, emphasizing that nothing extracts bad energy better than holy water. Barros asks if they should put more. The protagonist says yes and asks him to add more. After that, they go out on the streets and Karnak comments that today they caught tons. Hatoba is getting the good stuff for them, and things are going well. Barros says he would contact the Order to clean up the whole mess. Barros says they captured several necromancers. He notes that he was surprised when Alias asked for their help, since they had never met before. The protagonist says this shows how much they need help. He says they probably investigated the two after the incident in Gelfa City. Karnak says the only thing they would find out is that he lost his family to necromancers. Thanks to this, they would consider him the most likely person to hunt necromancers. Now they are bringing in important cases for free, and with that, they receive tons of sacred relics. The protagonist comments that he can't complain about that. Above all, they have the freedom to do things their way. Barros asks if it wasn't time to return, but the protagonist says not yet. Barros asks why. He replies that the protagonist is wanting to collect every bit of his power that has spread. The protagonist says no, that he is only blocking the paths through which his old power might spread. He says he's been thinking about it, and that this power spreads through portals in time. He is investigating the conditions for these portals to appear. He comments that maybe another 20 necromancers and they finish. Barros says that would take at least another 3 months. He says maybe some huge event is about to happen. As soon as he opens the door, a letter falls to the floor. The protagonist picks up the letter, asking what it was. He wonders if the order has already called them again. As soon as he reads the letter, Karnak sees that Alias wants to see them. The letter stated that he would explain better in person. He says he's feeling something big coming. At the Temple of Hatoba, Alias is happy to see them and welcomes them as soon as the protagonist and Barros arrive. There were 2 more people there. Alias says it's the first time they meet and introduces them, saying that one is Sarathi and the other is Relthane. Relthane introduces himself saying his name and that he is a 6th Circle mage. Sarathi also introduces herself saying her name and informing that she is from the Adventurers Guild. She is a swordswoman. The protagonist begins to speak telepathically again, saying that Sarathi is an aura user who awakened her martial energy at 20 years old. She is quite famous. Barros comments that she is of red level and says that this man named Relthane is also an advanced mage. Mages and martial energy users are classified into levels, depending on their power. The more circles a mage has, the more advanced spells he can use. A grand mage of the 10th circle becomes a being that transcends the limits of humanity. The protagonist has already reached the stage of grand mage, only lacking mana. An aura user who awakens martial energy is essentially the same. Red, blue, purple, silver, and then golden knight. Among them, becoming a golden knight is a stage only achieved by the 4th martial king. Relthane is a 6th circle mage and Sarathi is a red knight, so they are sufficient as support. The protagonist asks Barros if he never learned martial energy on his own. Barros sighs and says that even so, he fought on equal terms with the 4th martial king. He says the protagonist is poking at his weak spot. Karnak looks at them, saying he has heard a lot about the 2 and that it is an honor for them to meet the 2. Sarathi smiles and says he doesn't need to feel honored about that. She comes over all smiling and charmed by the protagonist, saying that Karnak and Barros are the vigilantes. So does that mean it was they who managed to capture so many necromancers in such a short time? The protagonist plays dumb and asks if that is indeed the case. Alias interrupts the 2 and says that everyone is already acquainted. Now he needs to continue the explanation of why they were there, as they don't have much time. He asks everyone to sit down. Alias mentions that they must have already noticed, but some problems have been arising. The priest mentions that recently their order got involved in an issue in the city of Trist, and it has been causing problems ever since. The city of Trist is located between the kingdom of Estil and the kingdom of Tarlum. It's a city that has long been disputed over its land. The kingdoms grew tired of fighting, sent a noble from each side to marry, and created the Trist Comital family to govern the now neutral land. However, the problem is that this city is situated in a prime location for trade. They lack the authority to properly manage the growing wealth and population, leading crime syndicates to take control. Thus, Trist was ruined by continuous crime, and the largest crime syndicates, the Ranfelts and the Plaths, expanded their power. Both clans claimed inheritance from the Trist bloodline and divided the city, but have been struggling to determine the true successor. The kingdoms, which were having trouble managing the city, agreed to recognize whichever side could properly govern the city as the new count. And so, the fight between the Ranfelts and the Plaths continued for decades, but the Plaths gained an advantage since the darkness of the apocalypse took over. The Plaths, who were involved in the slave trade, worked with necromancers who had similar goals. Then, the Plaths quickly began to attack the Ranfelts, but drew a lot of attention. The Ranfelts, upon discovering the Plaths' use of necromancers, reported it to the Order. The Order acted as soon as they confirmed the use of necromancy. The fight ended with the Ranfelts' victory, and the Plaths barely managed to keep their name. After hearing the story, the protagonist comments that it seems everything was resolved. Alias says that the problem is that the Ranfelts are also being accused of using necromancers. He says that, unlike the Plaths, they hid it. Sarathi stands up, irritated, asking if the 2 were the same, and if the Order didn't know about it. Alias says it's quite difficult to say with just the traces left by the darkness of the end. She gets very angry, saying that they could simply claim it wasn't them. This is unforgivable. Seeing all this anger, Barros gets a bit scared because it sounded very familiar to them. Suddenly, the protagonist also gets furious, slamming the table and asking whom she was calling people. He says that they gave up on being human. Barros looks at his master, thinking that he really had no shame. The protagonist continues to be angry, cursing them and saying that it's unforgivable. Barros comments that the reputation of the Hatoba Order is at stake. Relthane agrees, saying that they need to act carefully. If they make a mistake, it could cause problems for capturing necromancers in the future. He suggests that they should disguise themselves and enter the city. They ask Alias why he doesn't ask the Order's members to take care of it. He says he's ashamed to admit it, but someone has been leaking information from within the Order. He emphasizes that the previous group they sent disappeared without a trace. Alias says he suspects that this was the work of Bishop Straff. He's a high-ranking priest who helped the Ranfelts expel the Plaths. The protagonist asks if that means he hadn't informed the rest of the Order about this plan. Alias confirms, saying that he was acting on his own. He emphasizes that he has enough authority to do this, so he doesn't intend to report anything after it's done. He says they need concrete proof of the use of necromancy. Sarathi gets worried, saying that this could be dangerous, as the whole city could turn against them. Alias agrees, and says that's precisely why they were all called there. Alias looks at each of them and states that he believes they would all be able to defend themselves, even against everyone. In the basement of the Ranfelts' mansion, in the hallway chamber, some groans of pain were heard behind the door. There were people imprisoned and injured. 2 people arrive, commenting that it's been a while since the Order sent those people. A traitorous priest asks if it was time for the Order to act once again. The man responds that if it is, he would welcome everyone with open arms, smiling. He says they were just sending him more sacrifices. This man is Bishop Straff, from the Temple of Trist of the Hatoba Order. He begins using his magic, attacking the people there and draining their energy. A bit scared, the priest who was there comments that it's a large amount of energy and asks if the bishop's body could handle it. He says no, and that's why he begins using sacred magic. At the same time, he mentions that this way he can protect his body with the goddess's grace. Straff starts laughing and says that this time he hopes the Order sends strong adventurers because that way he'll be able to profit more. Outside, the whole group was ready. Alias says they've arrived and points to the city, saying that this is Trist. The entire place was in a deplorable state. The houses destroyed, rats everywhere, people dying of hunger. Alias comments that this is the result of uncontrolled crime. He tells everyone to hold on to their belongings tightly. Suddenly, a knife is thrown. Barros notices and dodges, protecting his master. The knife hits Relthane's coin pouch, causing it to tear. A hand appears, grabbing the coins before they even hit the ground. It was 3 children who had stolen from them. They run off, shouting to be quick. Relthane gets angry, shouting that they took his money. Alias comments that here it's every man for himself. Barros is impressed, saying that now he understands why it's called the City of Sin. Even small children are like this. Relthane asks how they could trust staying in any establishment. Alias responds that he knows a place and asks them to follow him. As soon as they look at the place, Sarathi gets scared and asks if he really wanted them to stay there, in the Plath's mansion. Alias starts laughing and confirms that yes, he does. They think that Alias wants them to stay in the house of the family he defeated, and wonder if overwork is driving him mad. They enter the mansion, and a person says they have no intention of making excuses, emphasizing that all those who dabbled in forbidden magic should be punished, including her father. This is Sildera, the head of the Plath's house. She asks if the Ranfelts didn't also break the laws, stressing that they couldn't let them go unpunished. Alias agrees with her and says that they can't just stand by and watch the Trist parish commit these acts of violence. Karnak thinks that Alias managed to direct the hatred toward the Trist parish. Alias looks at her and says that if they agree with this, he would be glad if she cooperated in the operation against the Ranfelts. She says she'll do her best to help and asks what his plan is. Sildera mentions that the Ranfelts have recently reinforced their security, so she thinks it's impossible to get close to the mansion unless it's someone of high level. Alias says he already expected that, which is why he thought of ambushing the Ranfelts' house. Relthane asks if he's serious, as this was a very simple plan. Alias affirms that it would work. Sildera says that the Ranfelts don't have much military strength on the property, so it's possible, but they have no information about the necromancers. She asks if that would be okay. Alias says it will be fine because all 4 of them are veterans in dealing with necromancers. Night falls, and at the Ranfelts' property, several guards are all around the house. While 2 guards are passing by, the whole group is hidden behind a wall. They light the bottle on fire and say that it's for the sake of their revenge. They start throwing the bottles and shouting, cursing the Ranfelts. The bottles hit the ground, spreading the fire, and the guards start shouting, saying that it's an ambush and that the group is on the other side of the wall. They tell the guards to handle the situation as everything catches fire, distracting the soldiers. The group sneaks past them. Sarathi comments that they are quite useful, and Alias agrees, saying they should take advantage of this and enter quickly because there's a stench of necromancy coming from the mansion. However, as soon as they look ahead, they realize there are several other soldiers who curse them and ask if the Plaths sent them. Relthane begins to unleash her power, asking the elite knights if they should greet each other before defeating everyone. She uses a fireball, causing a strong explosion that throws the soldiers away. Taking advantage of the lowered guard, she uses another ability called Lightning Chain. A huge chain forms around them, trapping some. They start shouting, asking how they were able to cast magic so quickly. However, the others tell them not to panic because there were 5 floors. With an empty look, Sarathi advances on the soldiers, who scream upon seeing her, saying that she is the battle sword Aura. She strikes with her aura, hitting some soldiers, who ask what an aura user was doing there. She falls among them and takes them down, eliminating several in seconds. Barros watches this while she says that this is how they should do it. He comments that her movements are quite disappointing. The protagonist says it's interesting to hear that from someone who doesn't even have a battle aura. While they are talking, 2 soldiers jump onto their backs, shouting that they will kill everyone. Barros says he will warm up a bit too, and with a simple movement, he throws the 2 away. The protagonist says he will join in to train a bit. He begins to use his magic, attacking some soldiers who fall to the ground, crying out in pain. As soon as they look at Elias, he is enraged, attacking the enemies, shouting and cursing them as evil. He continues attacking everyone, irritated, telling them to give up. The 2 watch and wonder where a priest learned to use a sword that way. The soldiers begin to retreat. Relthane says that apparently that was all their defense. Sarathi comments that something is strange and asks why the necromancers weren't appearing there. Alias suggests that maybe they are waiting inside the mansion, as that would be an advantage for them. After that, they enter the mansion, but it was all empty and silent. Suddenly, they hear a strange voice saying, "You have opened the way up to here." 3 people, along with a large spirit, state that an aura user and a high-level mage must be famous. They emphasize that all of this is useless against the power of darkness. The one with the scythe is a high-level undead, a specter. Alias thinks he has found the evidence, and everyone is happy about it. Sarathi asks if it's just about capturing them and returning. Alias replies that yes, they would already be enough as proof. The protagonist comments telepathically that those 3 would fetch good money. Alias agrees, saying that's good. The necromancers get angry, asking how they dare laugh like that, and order the specter to attack them, asking how long that smile would last. They command the specter to advance and absorb their vital essence. Alias begins to use his magic, saying, "The goddess's light will punish all that is impure." That aura starts to hit the specter. The necromancers get scared, shouting that he was a priest. Without wasting time, Sarathi advances on the specter and cuts it. But that was only the first target. She leaps once more and goes straight at the 3 necromancers behind. She approaches them, but as she was about to attack them, all of their heads are simply destroyed. Alias is in shock, arguing with her, saying that they had to take them, not kill them. She shouts that that wasn't her doing. The blood behind her begins to behave strangely, enveloping the place, and they wonder what is happening. It seems the mansion was transforming. That thing begins to take over the walls and doors from all sides. Sarathi steps on the ground to test, and even he has been taken over by that thing. They comment that the entire space there has been altered. Suddenly, someone starts laughing, saying that this harvest was good because there was an aura user, a 6th circle mage, and even Inquisitor Alias was there. Alias recognizes the voice and says he is sure that it is Bishop Straff from the Trist Parish. He smiles and says that they went there just because they suspected him. Alias responds that he didn't want to believe that a servant of the goddess could be tempted by the power of darkness. Relthane and Sarathi shout, informing that the exits were blocked and they couldn't destroy it. Alias says this is happening because they've been weakened by the darkness of the place, emphasizing that he will try to eliminate the death energy. He begins using his magic, but realizes that his divine power isn't working. Karnak notices that the divine power is feeding the necrotic energy. Straff starts laughing, asking if they really thought those they encountered were real necromancers. He asserts that they weren't, emphasizing that if necromancy's power was only that, why would the 7 orders be so cautious about the power of darkness? He asks Alias how it feels to encounter a real necromancer. The protagonist, telepathically, asks Barros to prepare. He asks why, and Karnak responds that if they're unlucky, that place could become their tomb. The protagonist says that it's a barrier mixing divine power and necrotic power, noting that he's never seen anything like it. Karnak comments that he can't do anything against it, since he can only use chaos mana and necrotic power. Barros is incredulous, asking if the protagonist really doesn't know about this. He questions how a priest in a remote village could cast a spell that even the god of death doesn't know. He says there's no way to escape, and everything around them begins to move. They notice something is emerging there. Several golems appear, and Alias comments that it's a death puppet, the Chaos Golem. They are surrounded by the golems. Suddenly, the golems start running towards them. Alias uses his barrier, but one of the golems punches it, cracking the entire barrier and making Alias spit blood. He shouts that the barrier won't hold for much longer. Relthane asks him to hold on just a little longer, because he's going to handle it. Relthane begins casting his fire magic, but the golem attacks again, shattering the barrier, and throwing them away. Alias and Relthane fall to the ground in front of two other golems, who capture them. Straff orders them to take the two to the dungeon where the others are. Sarathi tries to attack one of the golems, but is shocked to find that her attack had no effect on it. The golem grabs her, and Straff comments that the remaining two are useless, but that woman will serve well. The protagonist and Baros exchange glances, thinking that they are irrelevant, while the golem squeezes her. Straff observes that she has an interesting soul. Suddenly, Baros breaks the golem's arm with a strike and tells Sarathi that he warned her to be careful. With another blow, he hits the golem's chest, destroying it in just 2 strikes. On the ground, Sarathi looks at him, not understanding what just happened. She asks how he managed to do that without using aura. He explains that the weak points of chaos, golems are the places where mana doesn't flow. He emphasizes that the problem is that the flow keeps changing, making it difficult to locate these points, but he can do it because he has a lot of experience. He thinks that now she's on her own. The golems begin to surround them, and he thinks that the protagonist should appear now. He thinks again that the protagonist has to appear, that he needs to appear now. Karnak was worried, thinking that this was bad because his necromancy wasn't working either. He was trying to imbue that mist with his own necrotic power but still couldn't control it. He thinks that at this rate, they will lose, and that he needs to find another way. He begins attacking the golems while thinking he couldn't believe there were necromancy spells he didn't know. The protagonist remains still, thinking that there must be something more to this, but he has no idea what it is. He says he wants to test his theory. Baros continues attacking the golems, commenting that they are extremely annoying. Karnak continues attacking the golems with his magic, destroying them with ease. Straff bangs on the wall, furious, shouting and asking how those rats are killing his golems so easily. He says he shouldn't have underestimated those two, and wonders if he should have absorbed the necromancy scroll sealed in the Hatoba temple as well. Realizing that the golems wouldn't be able to handle them, he decides to try something else. Suddenly, something begins to force its way in, and a new spirit appears. The protagonist creates a barrier around him and shouts for Sarathi to run to them. However, the spirit was already closing in on her. Sarathi screams in fear, asking when that thing appeared. She apologizes and starts running. The protagonist observes, commenting that she's slower than he imagined. Realizing she won't be able to escape, she turns and tries to attack, but her strike passes through the spirit. Not understanding, she's hit by the spirit, screaming in pain. Weakened, she is captured by the spirit, and Straff shouts, saying that at least he managed to catch her. As she faints, the protagonist says he's already irritated. He calls Straff an amateur and begins to release a great amount of his power. The protagonist starts laughing, thinking that he was right. Straff, confused, asks what was happening as the barrier was disintegrating. Irritated, he asks the protagonist what he did. With a menacing aura, the protagonist replies that he didn't do much, just placed his own barrier over Straff's barrier. He mocks Straff, saying that he was acting all-powerful when, in reality, he's just a novice. Sarathi was lying on the ground, unconscious. Straff laughs, asking if he really is a novice, and says that now the protagonist will see the strength of a novice. He summons the dead from the underworld, and several of them appear. Baros asks how he managed to summon those dead. Karnak says there's not much he can do against that basic necromancy, so they need to handle it on their own. Baros will need to fight. Baros comments that all the undead seem strong. How could the protagonist call that basic? He emphasizes that Straff is stronger than he thought, and that if they keep going like this, they'll be fighting forever. The protagonist states that the longer they fight, the worse it will get for them, so every second they can rest is important. Karnak uses the Sober Blade, defeating several at once. Straff says that wasn't bad, but it's useless against his superior power. He summons the demon of Gehenna. A giant gate appears in front of them, and a demon begins to emerge from it. The demon asks his contractor what he desires. Straff orders him to kill those two people and bring the woman to him. The demon turns and asks whom he should kill. The protagonist comments that he has never seen a necromancer so easily deceived by an illusion. Straff asks, since when it became an illusion. The protagonist replies that since his barrier was broken, the entire fight was only against clones. Before disappearing, the protagonist says that Straff is quite the novice and that they will see each other around. Straff wonders if the whole fight, lasting more than half an hour with the clock stopped, was an illusion. He gets irritated, cursing the two of them. Outside, sitting calmly, they were laughing. Karnak comments that Straff is truly an idiot. That's what he gets for knowing only one spell. The protagonist says it couldn't even be considered an illusion, and yet he fell for it. Baros comments that thanks to that, they had enough time to escape. Baros asserts that it would be dangerous to return to Plath's territory now. The protagonist agrees, saying that the Ranfelts would look there first. Sarathi wakes up, sore all over, and says that they lied to her the whole time. The two look at her, and the protagonist asks if she's okay. Irritated, Sarathi tells them to stop pretending to care about her, calling them disgusting necromancers, and asks where they are. Karnak explains that they were outside the city to avoid the barriers, as they needed time to heal her. Sarathi asks if he said heal or kill. The protagonist responds that they were trying to be good people, they were just going to erase some of her memories. With a sad expression, she says it's okay, but she emphasizes that she can't feel her hands. This way, she wouldn't be able to live a normal life, much less be a swordswoman. She lowers her head and asks them to kill her. Barros perceives the situation and asks the protagonist if he could try using a healing spell from a skilled priest. Karnak intervenes, stating that they could not use sacred magic, as it would go against the natural order. Barros then questions his master if there was something they could do with necromancy. The protagonist, intrigued, asks if he was referring to that. At that moment, Sarathi overhears and, with hope, looks at Karnak and asks if he could use necromancy to give her arms back. The protagonist replies that it's possible but not recommended, as for her to accept necromancy, she would have to become his servant. He looks her in the eye and asks if she would be willing to be the servant of an evil necromancer, which scares her, making her reflect on what she had just heard. A necromancer can control the human soul, using it as a slave through a slavery contract. Many stories tell of adventurers captured who suffered cruel tortures before meeting their end. Sarathi thinks this is horrifying and that she cannot accept such a thing. She looks at her hand, lost in thought. Telepathically, the protagonist reprimands Barros for bringing that up on purpose. Barros smiles and asks if it was that obvious, explaining that as a swordsman, he understands the pain Sarathi was feeling and hopes he's not asking for too much. Noticing her hesitation, the protagonist calls out to her and says that although he's trying to distance himself from necromancy, seeing her in that condition affects him, but he can't tell her what to do. He points out, however, that if she accepts becoming his servant, she will regain her arms, but the decision is hers, and he will do whatever she asks. Still scared, Sarathi asks what would happen if she became his servant. The protagonist explains that once the contract is sealed, he will be able to see the structure of her soul, and with that information, will restore her arms. However, although she will maintain her free will, some restrictions will be imposed. Karnak looks at her and makes it clear that if she betrays him, she will face death. Sarathi lowers her head, reflecting that this could be dangerous, but it's not much different from the loyalty vow of knights. Karnak then questions her about what she prefers: lose your freedom or your future as a swordsman. He reinforces that this decision is hers alone. Sarathi's expression changes, and she finally looks at the protagonist, saying, "Lord Karnak, please accept me as your servant." The protagonist warns her that this will be the last time he asks if she is truly certain about what she wants. Without hesitation, Sarathi responds that nothing is more painful than never being able to hold her sword again. Karnak agrees and says they will begin. He extends his hand to her and in a solemn tone declares, "In the name of Karnak Jestard, Lord of Darkness, I summon you." He then asks, "Sarathi Alan, will you become my servant?" She replies yes. The magic begins to glow intensely as the protagonist instructs her to open her mind and accept the servitude contract, emphasizing that if she does, she will regain what she lost. The magical energy invades Sarathi's body, causing some pain, but her hands begin to regenerate, and she moans from the discomfort. The contract is sealed, and Sarathi, surprised, looks at her now restored hands. The protagonist confirms that from that moment, she has become his servant. Enchanted and smiling with happiness, she calls him master. Barros congratulates her and asks what they should do about the kidnappers. The protagonist comments that Straff's necromancy power is greater than he expected, and because of that, he will use his true powers on a grand scale, instead of just chaos mana, as he had done so far. Barros, concerned, sighs and warns that if he truly does that, the entire city will be completely destroyed. The protagonist ponders that for this reason, they have two choices: either prepare a plan to save Alias and Relthane, or give up and simply walk away. Barros asks if either of these choices would make them villains. They stare at each other for a moment, until Barros admits that being good is very difficult, and the protagonist agrees. Shocked, Sarathi interrupts, asking if choosing to save their friends wasn't the obvious choice. Barros, unfazed, responds that it's fine, even if it means using violent methods. Sarathi insists, saying that those who break the rules are considered trash, but those who abandon their friends are worse than trash. She concludes that saving their friends, regardless of the risks, is the right thing to do. Barros agrees, stating that if the intention is good, even the most evil methods are justifiable. The protagonist then celebrates, claiming he has no other choice but to use his true power. Barros also celebrates, mentioning that Sarathi said this would be justifiable. Alarmed by this conclusion, Sarathi interrupts, asking them to stop, questioning if that's really what she meant. Meanwhile, in the city, the Ranfelts were going door to door, pulling residents from their homes and asking if they had seen any suspicious outsiders. One of the men approaches a merchant, who is confused by the situation, asking what was going on, claiming to be just a merchant. The Ranfelt member orders the merchant to shut up and follow him, explaining that they had orders to capture all outsiders. In an alleyway, a man was leaning against a wall, wondering what they were doing so late at night, as he was tired. Another young man sees him and asks why he was still standing there, but the man with the bottle gets irritated and asks if he was trying to give him orders. The young man, equally irritated, responds in disbelief, asking if the man with the bottle thought they were doing this because they wanted to. At that moment, energy begins to emanate from the young man's sword, and he attacks the man. The man drops the bottle and yells, asking what the young man was doing and if he wanted to fight. The young man tries to explain that it was a misunderstanding, that the sword moved on its own, but the man attacks him, landing a hit. The other members order them to stop fighting and get back to work, but the man with the bottle begins to emit a strange aura. He turns around saying it was the young man who started it. However, something terrible happens. The man begins to transform into a monster. The members of the Ranfelts see this and shout that he was a monster and needed to be killed. The man with the bottle, shocked, begs them to wait, asking what monster they were talking about. However, it was too late, and the members attack him, killing him. All of this was the protagonist's manipulation, who was controlling the situation. He comments that the city is so corrupt that people panic at any problem. He starts absorbing the energy around him, stating that he can easily strengthen his necromancy powers. Sarathi, shocked, asks why he had to do that, and the protagonist responds that he was creating an army of the undead. She asks in disbelief if he would really do that right here. Karnak then intervenes, explaining that it's the best strategy to face Straf, and that, fortunately, he had enough energy to affect the entire city if he wanted to. However, there was a problem. There weren't enough bodies for him to control, so with no other choice, he would need to create more. Barros, excited, comments that, despite being cruel, it's necessary to save their friends, so there was no other option. Sarathi, watching the two, wonders if all this was right, but recognizes that if she hadn't intervened, they would have left everyone behind. As she reflects on the situation, she realizes that the protagonist isn't as cruel as the rumors suggested, as he was only focusing on the members of the Ranfelts and sparing the common citizens. Meanwhile, the Ranfelts were engaged in an intense battle among themselves, arguing and killing each other. They wonder what was happening, as it had turned into a true war. From the rooftop, Sarathi was still horrified by the scene. Karnak, observing, says that it seems everything is working as expected, remarking that it should be enough to balance things out. When everything seemed to come to an end, the protagonist begins casting his magic and says, "Awaken, my army." His magic strikes all the fallen bodies on the ground, and they begin to rise as monsters. As they march, Sarathi becomes even more terrified, thinking she should abandon her old ideas and recognize that the protagonist was truly evil. A gigantic army of the undead takes over the streets of the city, and the protagonist orders everyone to move forward. Sarathi feels fear, questioning whether she would really be okay being the servant of someone with so much power. Several monsters were already approaching the mansion, and a fierce battle begins between them and the undead, who fight back. From a distance, the protagonist observes and comments that, although the plan is working, Straf's necrotic power is much greater than he had anticipated, as he managed to summon a death dragon and 7 trumpeters. Karnak, surprised, reflects that he should be the only one capable of using such a spell. He then ponders that the past has changed, and some people may have gotten hold of some of his items. The protagonist interrupts, saying it was time to leave, as if they stayed there, they would be discovered. Sarathi, curious, asks what would be discovered, and the protagonist explains that the zombies are just illusions. Shocked, she asks if they were really only illusions. He confirms, saying that most of them were, and asks Sarathi if she really believed he could create such a large army in so little time. In his thoughts, he admits that he actually could, but Sarathi, relieved, starts laughing, saying the protagonist did well and that he was right. Now they needed to hurry. She reflects that her lord might be a better person than she had imagined. Inside the mansion, the two were tied to an altar, while Straf controlled everything. He comments that those zombies are nothing but pests in numbers. He wonders what exactly they are and where the protagonist was. Suddenly he hears a voice saying that this was bigger than he had imagined and that he had never suspected the existence of something like this beneath the city. Straf is surprised and recognizes the voice, As he turns, he sees the protagonist before him. Karnak smiles and says that he had already warned they would meet soon. Straff wonders how they managed to get there. Karnak comments that Straff seems quite tired, suggesting that fighting the zombies must have exhausted him. Sarathi, upon seeing her friends lying on the altar, states that they were about to be offered as sacrifices to the demon, but luckily, they were still okay. Straff then asks if all of this was the protagonist's doing, and, irritated, says that even though he's tired, he can still face them all. He swears that they will all regret coming there, and orders the undead to attack. Sarathi and Baros move forward to confront them. Karnak begins to cast his magic, saying, "Come, soul slaves, I summon you from the depths of purgatory, echoes of the underworld." Spirits begin to emerge, attacking the undead and destroying them one by one. The battle intensifies and chaos takes over. Straff, surprised by how quickly the protagonist handles the situation, becomes even more irritated and decides to use all his resources, summoning the demon of Gehenna once again. The demon emerges from the magic circle, and Sarathi is frightened, while Baros nervously comments that Straff never gets tired of calling the same demon. The protagonist laughs and asks why he's repeating the summoning, saying it's getting boring. Karnak, observing the situation, concludes that Straff's power must be at its limit after this summoning. He begins to cast a spell that envelops the demon, who, confused, asks what is happening. The protagonist explains that it's a counter-summoning and says that since the demon has already appeared, it's time to return. The demon tries to resist, emanating its aura and causing an explosion, but it manages to break free from the spell. It then asks Straff what he desires, and the contractor orders the demon to kill the men and take the woman. Satisfied, Straff declares that everything finally worked. The demon unleashes its power, affirming that it will fulfill Straff's request. Sarathi, stunned, comments on the crushing pressure the demon creates. The protagonist, for his part, asks why the portal didn't close, admitting that something went wrong and orders Sarathi and Baros to fight for the time being. They move forward, but their attacks are ineffective. The demon ridicules them and, with a strike, creates an explosion, forcing them to retreat. The protagonist then concentrates fire in his hand and taunts the demon, asking if that too seemed weak. He launches several fireballs, but the demon easily absorbs them all. Sarathi comments that if the demon were a knight, he would be close to the purple level. Baros, on the other hand, says that if he had awakened his battle aura, he would give the demon a beating. The protagonist looks at them and suggests to Baros that they use Plan P, leaving Baros surprised and questioning if they really had such a plan. Karnak begins to envelop Baros with his magic, saying that this was part of his lineage. Confused, Sarathi asks why this was happening suddenly, as the protagonist had said Baros was not part of his lineage. The protagonist responds, ordering Baros to open his mind and accept the magic. Baros, with his eyes glowing blue, begins to feel the energy, and Sarathi also starts being enveloped by the same force. Plan P is then revealed to be possession, and Baros takes control of Sarathi's body. Smiling, he comments that it had been a long time since he last did this. Sarathi's consciousness, desperate, screams as she realizes that when the protagonist spoke of lineage, he was referring to her. The protagonist in turn shouts, "Go, Sarah Baros," and Baros, using Sarathi's body, moves forward, apologizing for needing to borrow her body. Sarathi, crying, asks him to take good care of her body and return it in one piece. The demon, confused, asks how someone who is not a user of aura dares to face him. He must be using someone else's battle aura. The sword's aura begins to flow, and Baros shouts, asking who told the demon that he couldn't use aura. The demon, surprised, sees Baros's attack land a precise cut, deeply wounding him. Baros remembers his previous life and, laughing, states that using someone else's battle aura is his specialty. Irritated, the demon realizes that Baros hit his weak spot perfectly and is much stronger than before, making the fight complicated. Suddenly, Baros's aura changes to blue, surprising both. Sarathi, confused, wonders if she became a blue knight because Baros is using her body. Baros in turn praises Sarathi's latent power, saying that thanks to it, he can now fight with more ease. Jumping once more, he lands several blows on the demon, making it bleed profusely. As he attacks, Baros laughs, and the demon, powerless, continues to receive the blows, unable to react, screaming in pain and disbelief at the beating he's taking. Baros, completely overtaken by the desire to fight, doesn't stop attacking and advancing, laughing as he dodges the demon's strikes. When the demon fails once again to hit him, Baros mocks, asking if that was the best he had. Wounded and covered in cuts, the demon insists that Baros hasn't won yet, claiming that as soon as he stops possessing Sarathi's body, the fight will be over. Desperate, the demon launches a powerful energy blast toward the protagonist, causing a massive explosion. The demon begins to laugh, believing that the protagonist has finally been defeated, but to his surprise, the protagonist's voice echoes, asking what he was doing. The protagonist laughs and says he fooled both the summoner and the summoned, calling them both fools. Suddenly, several illusions of the protagonist appear around, leaving the demon even more confused. Karnak then asks the demon if he really thought the protagonist wouldn't notice his intentions. The demon, disoriented, wonders which prota he should attack, but before he could decide, Barros is already behind him. Barros lands several quick strikes, and the demon screams in pain, starting to bleed even more. He realizes he exerted himself too much trying to escape the counter-summoning, and now has no mana left to keep fighting. With his hand on his chest, which bled uncontrollably, the demon admits he never imagined that a simple human could wound him so gravely. Suddenly, a portal opens beneath the demon, and Barros shouts that the portal is active. The demon, with no way out, points at Barros and says that this time he's leaving, but he will return to ensure that Barros neither lives nor dies, a promise made directly from hell. The protagonist, irritated, asks the demon if he really believes he can escape after everything that has happened. The protagonist attacks the demon, declaring that he will be extinguished here and now. The protagonist's aura begins to trap the demon and lift him up. The demon screams in desperation, saying that his mana was flowing in reverse, and he starts to swell. Shouting, he says that this cannot be happening, but his body can't withstand the pressure and explodes, creating a bright light. All of the protagonist's illusions begin to disappear, and the two return to their bodies. Sarathi falls to the ground, trembling and screaming in pain, asking if it always hurt this much. Barros smiles and thanks her for allowing him to use her body, commenting that when she releases her aura, the pain will be less. The protagonist cracks his neck and says that now there was only one piece of trash left to deal with. Straff, realizing that the protagonist's strength was on another level, sighs and surrenders, saying he will tell them everything they want to know. Karnak, confused, looks at him and comments that Straff seems to not understand the situation. Nervously, Straff asks what he means by that. The protagonist explains that it would be easier to kill him and interrogate his soul in the underworld. Karnak questions why complicate things. The protagonist then asks Sarathi if there was any reason not to kill that man. She responds that there isn't, and orders the protagonist to kill him. Karnak smiles, saying that Sarathi's request is in order. With just a gesture, he casts his magic, which flies towards Straff. Terrified, Straff screams for the protagonist to wait, but the magic had already reached his neck. His screams echo, and everything ends with Straff's body falling to the ground. The protagonist then uses his magic again, saying it was time to get to work. He creates a sphere of energy over Straff's body and begins to absorb everything, commenting that the amount of energy was worth 30 portions. Barros, excited, says that they can finally go home. The two begin to laugh, and the protagonist, satisfied, asks Barros if he wants to return. Barros replies yes, adding that he would like to find a good restaurant on the way. As they talk, Sarathi interrupts them, shouting, reminding them that they couldn't just leave those two behind. The protagonist admits he had forgotten about them. As soon as the two wake up, frightened, they ask if the three of them really managed to defeat the entire Ranfelts and Straff himself. Relthane, incredulous, comments that such a man couldn't be defeated by just 3 people. Karnak explains that they were lucky, mentioning that after Relthane and Alias were injured and taken to the basement, an army of zombies surrounded the place. He says that other necromancers took advantage of the opportunity to start a rebellion. Relthane agrees, saying it makes sense when analyzing the situation. The protagonist then explains that Straff was low on power and therefore ran to the basement, and he and Sarathi seized that opportunity to defeat him. He emphasizes that this is exactly what happened while the other two slept. Alias sighs, saying that this must have been a blessing from Hatoba and that they were indebted to the protagonist. Karnak mentions that no one has touched Straff's corpse and asks Alias to perform the purification. Alias goes to the body and begins the ritual. As he places Straff's aura inside a bottle, he is surprised by the quantity, noting that compared to other necromancers, the amount of dark power Straff possessed was 10 times greater. Telepathically, Barros asks the protagonist why there was still necromancer power left and why he didn't take it all. Karnak responds that it would have been too obvious if he had taken everything at once. Alias then comments that with Straff's defeat and the fall of the Ranfelts, the city will soon return to normal. The group decides to leave the rest of the work to the Order, as the day was dawning, and they plan to return. As they were about to say their goodbyes, Alias suddenly shouts in shock, asking if Sarathi had really become a Knight of Jestard. Relthane, equally shocked, asks what he's talking about, and Alias questions why Sarathi did that. The protagonist, surprised, wonders if this was really so shocking, while Sarathi, with a slightly uncomfortable expression, responds that after the events of the previous day, She realized that Baron Karnak was someone worthy of her allegiance. She gives a small laugh to cover it up, but the protagonist comments that she doesn't seem too happy with her decision. Alias understands, noting that it's good she found someone to serve, and Karnak agrees, saying they would go to his territory to formalize everything. Alias bids farewell, taking the protagonist's hand and thanking him for his help, while Karnak comments that they will meet again when the opportunity arises. Sometime later, back at the Jestard estate, Japel and the servants were ecstatic with their lord's return. The protagonist smiles, happy to see everyone again, and Japel welcomes them, asking how they had been during this time. Suddenly, Japel notices Sarathi and wonders who this beautiful woman was, imagining if his master had something in mind. Everyone is shocked, but Karnak quickly explains that Sarathi Allen is the new knight of the Jestard cavalry. She bows, introducing herself, saying it's a pleasure to meet them. Japel, however, shows concern, saying that although the territory was on high alert, it wasn't wise to choose just anyone as a knight, as that could be problematic. Barros asks Sarathi to demonstrate her skills, and she draws her sword, emanating a powerful aura, surprising everyone. She then strikes the ground with her sword, destroying everything in front of her and cutting a tree in half, leaving the onlookers astonished, exclaiming that she truly was an aura user. Sarathi smiles and sheathes her sword, saying she looks forward to getting to know them better. Japel, still intrigued, wonders what someone as valuable as her was doing in a place like that. A few weeks later, Sarathi was training with the other knights, who watched the fight and commented that her opponent was at a disadvantage. They noticed that Sarathi, even being lighter and using only her normal strength, was easily winning. Impressed, they remarked that aura users are truly incredible. Suddenly, her opponent's sword flies far away, ending the training. The knight admits that Sarathi is very strong as he expected, and suggests ending the session there. Sarathi agrees, satisfied, saying it was a good training session. While the other knights leave to grab a beer, Barros appears, thanking Sarathi for helping with the training. He smiles and asks if he can be her next opponent. The two begin to spar, and Barros comments that Sarathi's use of battle aura wasn't ideal, explaining that she wasted too much power and needed to learn how to use the right amount in each strike. Sarathi, tired, thinks that talking is easy, but doing is another story. She steps back and asks Barros to possess her again, saying that if he does it a few more times, she'll be able to understand better. Surprised, Barros asks if she's really talking about possession and warns that it's not safe to repeat it, as if they do it 3 times, her soul could become corrupted, and she could lose her sanity. Sarathi, scared, becomes pensive, and Barros reassures her, saying that she is very talented and will become very strong without needing that. Worried by what he said, Sarathi admits they did something dangerous, but Barros, smiling, comments that later she'll need to help him awaken his own battle aura, and because of that, it's better to stop for now. Meanwhile, in his office, the protagonist was sitting, reflecting on how Straff managed to combine necromancer power with divine power. He wondered if there was any ability capable of uniting his power with another energy, but he concludes that if such an ability existed, he would have already learned it. Frustrated, the protagonist admits that he has no idea what it could be. Deciding to set aside these thoughts, he focuses on closing the rift that was spreading darkness. Thoughtfully, he reflects that he already knows the darkness of the apocalypse flows through space-time and spreads across the earth. Creating a barrier around himself, the protagonist begins gathering powerful energy, determined to create a body strong enough to explore the dangerous space-time. First, he needs to clear several threads of darkness and manipulate them carefully without making any mistakes. The ball of energy begins to form an eye within it, and the protagonist holds it in the palm of his hand, declaring that this was the powerful body capable of investigating space-time. He calls it the Eye of Darkness. Night falls, and in the forest within Deventor territory, near the Jestard territory, they sit around a campfire. The protagonist looks at Barros and asks if what he's saying is serious. Karnak, surprised, questions if he still hasn't awakened his battle aura, and the protagonist adds, reminding Barros that he was once considered the greatest martial artist in the world. Nearly in tears, Barros responds that this was before he regressed in time, and with a touch of nostalgia, mentions that he misses the times when the protagonist was the king of death, when everything was easier, especially after he received the black battle aura from him. As the two discuss, Sarathi, confused and scared, reflects on the conversation she just overheard, wondering how she ended up involved with these two. During their journey, the protagonist had told her the whole story, and Sarathi felt completely lost trying to understand the protagonist's global domination and the regression in time. Looking back, she realizes that, from the beginning, she knew they weren't ordinary knights or nobles, but still couldn't imagine the true extent of the power they both possessed. After all, they were transcendents who had conquered the world, and beyond that, dealt with the manipulation of time itself. Watching the two eat and smile like children, Sarathi can't help but wonder how she ended up in this group. She then comments that she knows they are trying to raise the Eye of Darkness, but she still doesn't understand why they are in Devantor territory. Karnak explains that it's because it would be a major inconvenience to get caught using necromancy in their own territory. Karnak starts to tremble with rage, saying that when he thinks about what Devantor did to his family, what they were doing was just a mere prank. Sarathi hears this, and suspicious, wonders if it's true. The protagonist says it's time to start. He creates the Eye of Darkness once again, and Sarathi asks what he's going to do with it. Karnak says he'll send it through space-time and try to find a way to close the doors of darkness. He releases the eye, which starts to rise at high speed. They watch the magic, and Sarathi asks if it isn't all too quiet. The protagonist says it's because they haven't opened space-time yet. He's just looking inside. He tells the two that he'll use the eye to enter the infinite realm, and while he's doing that, he'll be unconscious, so the two of them have to protect him. The two say they understand, and the protagonist closes his eyes, concentrating as much as possible until he connects with the eye. He starts to see with the eye and says it's working. The protagonist looks around searching for something. Suddenly he sees something in front of him and goes closer to see what it was. As he approaches, he's impressed. Looking at that tree, he says that it seems he found it. That is the Astrashnaf Void Tree. Karnak says that's the true form of the authority he used to wield. The protagonist thinks that even being his authority, it's still quite ugly. While he's looking at everything, a fruit detaches and starts to fall. The fruit falls into the water and goes through it, leaving the protagonist surprised. Finally, he discovered how the darkness was spreading. Now, he just needed to stop it. Karnak starts to look for the authority's core. After searching for a bit, he sees accumulated energy and says that it seems to be there. Karnak approaches it, while wondering if he can get any more information. As he gets closer, a voice appears saying, "Back off, mortal." The protagonist is confused by this, wondering what's going on. The voice comes again and says, "This place is forbidden for those destined to disappear." Irritated, Karnak shouts, asking who is speaking. The voice says it is death, the darkness destined to destroy. Suddenly the water starts to move, creating waves and showing a frightening aura. Karnak asks what's happening. He thinks that this power is the darkness of the end. He wonders how his power is being controlled so easily. The voice says, "In the name of Tesranik." The protagonist shouts, asking who Tesranik is. The voice starts to repeat, "Return, return, you pitiful mortal." The darkness begins to move, causing a huge explosion and expelling the protagonist from the infinite realm. From afar, the protagonist starts to hear a voice calling him. As he begins to regain consciousness, he realizes that Barros was calling him. Barros asks if he's okay. With a headache, Karnak asks what happened. Barros says that the protagonist's body started to float and suddenly he fainted. Barros asks if something went wrong. Karnak says he'll explain everything later. The protagonist asks what the name of the god that the cultists believe in is. Sarathi asks if he's talking about Tesranik. She says that he is the black god of death and darkness, whom the Order of the Black God serves. Karnak says that guy was there. Barros is shocked, asking if he's talking about the god of the cultists. He asks if this god is really real. The protagonist says it can't be, but he still doesn't know why something like that exists. Elsewhere, 3 people were together and concentrated. Suddenly, one of them says they have a problem inside the sanctuary. That is the Order of the Black God, and this man is called the Pope of Death. Another man asks what he's talking about, as that place is considered a sanctuary because nothing can approach it. This is the Dark Lord, also from the Order of the Black God. A woman says this is all strange. She is the priestess of destruction and is also part of the Order of the Black God. She emphasizes that she needs to personally confirm it. Returning to the normal world, she rings the bell, thinking there was a problem at the sanctuary. A woman comes running, asking if she had called. She asks the maid if she could call Hudel for her, as she was looking for him. Her real name is Elazar de Repletion, an imperial mage of the Linartea Empire, one of the 3 archmages, and a priestess of destruction. Back at the mansion, the protagonist says that in the end, he couldn't find any way to stop the opening. He notes that after that, he tried several other methods, but all were without results. And if that continues, they could be found. He says this is very dangerous. The protagonist says that all he managed to discover is that the Order of the Black God believes in Tesranik. He says the problem is the kind of stance they take. Barros and Sarathi ask, "What stance?" Karnak explains that they are people who take advantage of the power that falls from the tree, or they could be people who are disturbing the tree to obtain random powers. He emphasizes that, if it's the latter option, they will have a big problem. Sarathi asks what the difference is between the two. The protagonist explains that disturbing the tree means they are capable of influencing powers beyond time and space, and that means they can cultivate the realm. He says this task is very difficult, and that even for him it would take years, as this was the first time-space regression spell. Karnak says that if the Order of the Black God is disturbing the tree, then they have an absolute power that goes beyond his powers as the King of Death. Baros and Sarathi are frightened. He says that if they have that kind of power, they don't need to do anything unnecessary, and that's why they are able to contain Tesrenik in the void. Baros asks where this guy came from. The protagonist says he doesn't know. Sarathi has an idea. She asks if it's possible that a part of his powers gained consciousness and became this Tesrenik. Baros says she needs to stop reading those stories. He sighs, asking if that makes sense to her. How could a power have consciousness? Karnak interrupts and says that this could be true. Baros turns around, surprised. The protagonist says that nothing about this topic makes sense. Baros asks if he's suggesting that the tree named itself Tesrenik and is acting like a god. He asks if that means the protagonist can create gods now. He emphasizes that Karnak needs to control those thoughts. Annoyed, the protagonist asks who said that this is the truth. He just mentioned that there's a chance. Sarathi is a bit worried and says they still don't know the truth, but the protagonist says she's right. They sigh, and he says he needs to investigate the Order of the Black God first. He emphasizes that the lower members would be of no use, so he needs to investigate the high officials if he wants useful information. Baros says it would be difficult to find these people with the current methods. Karnak says they might need to join the Order of Kings. Order of Kings, a special imperial organization created to hunt members of the Order of the Black God after the Era of Chaos. Under the orders of the Order of the Seven Goddesses, Inquisitors and Hunters of Darkness hunted necromancers. Moreover, the appearance of the Order of the Black God across the continent began to cause problems, especially since various members of the high nobility and royalty joined the Order of the Black God. It was difficult for the Order of the Seven Goddesses to handle everything alone. Therefore, the seven nations united and developed a special division, the Order of Kings. Members of the Order of Kings received the right to censor, allowing them to investigate and arrest those suspected of being cultists, with rare cases allowing them to execute individuals. Because of this, the selection conditions were strict, and you can only join through recommendations. He says that's the problem. How should they have connections with such an imperial organization? Baros says he was known as a hunter of darkness for a long time, so maybe he should have worked closer to the capital. Sarathi asks if their plan is just to enter the Order of Kings. She says that if they want, she can give them an opportunity to enter now, mentioning that she would ask for a recommendation. The two are surprised. Baros is happy, calling her a lady, and asks if she really has such connections. The protagonist starts eating and says that this is perfect, telling them to pack their bags, as they would go there now. He says she is his best servant. The next day at the mansion, screams were heard. Japel found a letter that the protagonist had left, saying, "To Japel, I need to go away for a while. Don't worry about me. I will bring fame and honor to the family." Japel starts crying, asking where his lord ran off to again without notifying. In the city of Durarth, the three were sitting having coffee. Baros asks if it was okay to have left that way. They just wrote a letter and left in the middle of the night. Karnak says that if they had spoken personally, Japel would not have let them leave like that. As a lord, he should not be away for long periods. Suddenly, someone arrives saying that the three were already there, apologizing for the delay. They are happy, welcoming them and saying that they had just arrived too. He thinks their recommendation has just arrived. The other day, the three were having coffee. Karnak asks how he has been doing, thanking him for coming as soon as the protagonist called. Alias, smiling, says he was glad to hear that from the protagonist. The night before, the three were looking at a person through the window. Sarathi is surprised and asks if Karnak had really asked Alias for a recommendation. The protagonist asks if the King's Order and the Order of the Seven Goddesses are separate organizations. He points out that one has nothing to do with the other. However, Karnak needed a cleric to capture a necromancer. She explains that the King's Order needs the support of a cleric from the Order of the Seven Goddesses. When they are accepting members, there is a condition that they need to receive a recommendation or be evaluated by them. A first-ranking inquisitor like Alias has the authority to make a recommendation. As they ran, the protagonist asks how she knew all this. Sarathi says she heard it from Alias himself. She says he called them to the Renfault family incident with the plan to give them a recommendation in the first place. Back in the present, a little embarrassed, Alias smiles, saying it was a shame the protagonist had said he would return to his territory so suddenly, because he would have recommended the three for the King's Order. He emphasizes that he was quite happy that the three had come back there because of that. Karnak says they almost missed a great opportunity. Alias hands over the recommendation letter to the protagonist, saying he could take that to the headquarters. Alias makes it clear that this does not mean they would get in, but he thinks that if it's just the three of them, it will be possible. He says he is asking Hatoba to bless all of them. Happily, Karnak takes the letter and thanks him. After a while, in the capital of the kingdom of Ustil Duntra was the headquarters of the king's order. Inside, several people were together. The three get there and, looking around, say that everyone there seemed quite talented. Karnak points out that everyone there seemed better than he imagined. Sarathi says she has already seen 2 aura users. She says the capital really is different. Suddenly, someone arrives behind them and starts saying that they must have waited a lot. The man says they were confirming the recommendation letter they brought, and that he would now take them to the Lord of the Order. After that, the three go to a room to meet with the Lord. As soon as they enter, the Lord welcomes them. He introduces himself, saying he is the commander of the King's Order, and his name is Erantel von Nayad, a purple knight. Karnak greets him, saying it is a pleasure to meet such a person. Erantel says he himself confirmed the recommendation letter of the three, and that they are also qualified. Besides, their identity is secure. Erantel emphasizes that, above all, the recommendation was made by Alias, which means that they are really trustworthy, but Erantel asks if they are aware that this is not enough to enter the order. Karnak says he heard kind of in passing that there was training for new members. Erantel says this is to prevent pagans from infiltrating. He says he would give them their first task. Baros is surprised by this, and Sarathi says they have just joined. Erantel starts laughing, saying this is their line of work, so they are always busy. Smiling, he welcomes them to the king's order. The protagonist looks at him, thinking that this is not going to work. He wonders if they would make him and his team work like crazy and then be dismissed. As soon as they leave the room, they meet some more people. A young man greets them, saying his name is Jarman. He says he is the 4th general of the battalion and that he would teach them throughout the internship. This man is the 2nd son of Viscount Alban and is currently in the 5th magical circle. Another man introduces himself, saying his name is Called. He is a dual-blade swordsman from Delum. A young woman also introduces herself, saying her name is Alice. She is a 2nd-ranking inquisitor of the ocean goddess Artima. The protagonist says it's a pleasure to meet them, but he asks if the order isn't always too busy for him to have to start working immediately. Jarman says that, unfortunately, Karnak arrived on a bad day, as they were in the middle of a mission. Baros says he wasn't expecting the general to be a mage. Jarman asks why, questioning if Baros finds it strange that a 5th circle mage has an aura user as a subordinate. Baros says he didn't mean to imply he was weak. Jarman says that, in the line of service, identity is only a part of the skills, as they have to deal with similar powers. He says that, in their world, the power of families is more important than skills. He explains that with work, Baros would understand. However, the main work of the King's Order is the collection of information while they chase pagans, kidnapping key figures and interrogating, not just fighting. Jarman emphasizes that just because a person is strong in fighting doesn't mean they would be good at this job. Sarathi asks why all this explanation sounds like they are the bad guys. Smiling, Jarman says she's right. Their job is to do bad things to pagans. He says this is because mages can use various methods that are more advantageous in this job than aura. He says that the majority of the generals in the King's Order are mages. Sarathi asks if that means clerics are also not qualified. Alice explains that the King's Order was also made to keep the Order of the 7 Goddesses in check, and therefore they couldn't give a cleric the order of general. Sarathi says that really makes sense. Jarman says that now that everything has been explained, he would give the details of the mission. He begins to say that they received information that a noble region had joined the Order of the Black God. The suspect is Count Brelant, in the south of the kingdom of Ustil. Jarman says they would disguise themselves as adventurers and head to the county of Brelant. That way they would gather enough evidence before punishing the count in the name of the king. Jarman apologizes, but those are the details they have. He doesn't know anything more. The protagonist is shocked by this, asking if that was really all. He asks if they have to complete this mission even without knowing if the count really is a pagan. With a strange face, Jarman says that's what the King's Order was made for, to find something. The three are disheartened by this. The protagonist says he now understands why the King's Order is so busy. Baros sighs, saying this is driving him crazy. Meanwhile, at Count Brelant's castle, a heavy rain falls. The count is worried about his son, who is lying in bed, sick. Suddenly someone appears there, calling the count and saying that his son's illness is getting worse every day. The person says the count needs to open his eyes right now. The count turns and says there's no way he can do that. He asks the person if they think he doesn't know the fate of people who turn to necromancy. He says that bringing someone back from death isn't right. The body would be nothing more than an empty shell. He says that has been the case so far. The man says they couldn't really call that necromancy, emphasizing that the Count needs to serve Tesrenik, as he is the true power of darkness. Thus, the Count could use it appropriately. He says if he does that, death won't be a fate, but rather the outcome of a disease the Count can't cure. They ask how the Count could call the cure of a disease a demonic act. The people present continue talking that the Count's son is still young and has a lot ahead of him. As soon as the Count hears this, he becomes somewhat unsure of what to do. As the Count looks at his sick son, people keep talking and asking if accepting death as a fate for a young child is normal. They ask if he really thinks there's logic in those words. The Count's son grips his hand, breathing heavily, and calls for his father. The Count, desperate, watching his son pass away before his eyes without another choice, is at a loss for words. This makes him start thinking that the Order of the Seven Goddesses doesn't send any help anyway. The Count grips his son's hand tightly, thinking that if he could give his son a new life. Decided, he stands up and says he wants to convert to Tesrenik. He asks if they would accept him. The next day, at the tavern on the outskirts of Breland County, Jarman was saying that they would start gathering information from now on. He says that, as obvious as it might seem, they can't be recognized or let others know they are from the King's Order, as they don't want to raise any alerts. He hands a paper to the protagonist and his group, saying they need to act like pagans. Barros asks what that was. Jarman says it's a wanted list. That man on the sheet is Hillen Krat, a notorious criminal wanted in the capital. Jarman says he is talented with disguises, which is why he hasn't been caught yet. The three look, and Barros asks if that man was connected to the incident. Jarman replies that no, in fact, he has nothing to do with the incident. He emphasizes that the man looks like that and currently is one of their members. This leaves Barros confused. Jarman explains that from now on, they are bounty hunters after that criminal. He highlights that now they will all be trying to gather information as bounty hunters. He says they will split into 3 teams and go around to investigate further. They start looking for information, asking people if they've seen that man. Everywhere in the town, they were looking for anything odd, even at the Count's mansion. Jarman was with Barros. He apologizes to the Count for showing up so suddenly. They introduce themselves, saying they came from the Adventurers Guild and are bounty hunters. Jarman says that, from what he has heard, the criminal fled to the county. He asks if the Count could cooperate a little. Without hesitation, the Count says yes, emphasizing that a dangerous man like that, walking freely around there, could be bad for them too. They stand up, and Jarman thanks him, saying they wouldn't do anything that could harm the Count. After establishing cooperation with the Count, they leave the mansion. Barros asks if that was serious. Jarman says yes, and says they need to go back to the tavern. Barros is surprised, asking if they had already finished. He questions what the point of meeting the Count was, and if that was all they were going to do now. Jarman smiles and says that, even though it may not seem like much, it was enough. He says they already know who he is. Night falls and they gather at the tavern to exchange information. Kald says that the Count's wife passed away young, and the only family he has is his son. The protagonist says that, besides that, there are rumors that the Count's son has a disease that cannot be cured, even with divine power. Jarman comments that this is the perfect situation for the Black God. Kald says another suspicious thing is that suddenly the public safety of the territory improved. They say it's thanks to the Count himself, exiling the criminals. He comments that if that really happened, those criminals should be amassing in other villages, but they haven't heard anything about it on their way there. Alice says that the disappearance of people on a large scale is quite common with necromancy. Jarman says they went personally to meet the Count and discovered interesting things. He tells them that all the windows had thick curtains, as if there was a reason to block out all sunlight. Kald comments that this is a familiar occurrence, usually meaning a vampire. Later that night at the Count's castle, he and his son were at the table. The Count asks his son if he has any resentment against him. With red eyes and a lot of health, the son asks why he would have any resentment. Because for the first time, he was seeing how life can be pleasant. He emphasizes that humans also need to kill and eat to survive, and that he only eats what the Order caught for him, so he wasn't hurting anyone. He says it was just a small change in the environment and the food. The Count says he feels a bit more relieved knowing his son thinks like this. He looks at his son, thinking everything is all right, because he remains the same, intelligent and well-mannered. The Count thinks he has finally understood. The Order of the Black God is just a group of heretics, a measure fitting for the new era. In his thoughts, he believes that when Lord Tesrenik descends to Earth, creating a paradise where life and death exist in harmony, his son will be able to live a decent life. Looking at his son, he says it might be uncomfortable at the moment, but asks him to hold on just a little longer, promising that he won't let him live like this forever. The next day, Sarathi and Alice were walking. Sarathi, a bit disheartened by all this, says they already know his identity, so why do they need to keep investigating? Alice responds that it's because they have to stay alert until they have concrete evidence about the matter. She says they would continue working hard. Suddenly, someone calls out to them. A man asks if they were bounty hunters. Alice says yes and asks what they could do for him. The guy says they found the man they were looking for, emphasizing that the Count asked to deliver that paper to their group. The two are surprised, thinking they found a false wanted person. The whole group gathers once again. After the report, Jarman asks if the Count really gave them the hideout of a non-existent person. Alice says yes. She tells them that they were told he goes there every night to sleep and that they should infiltrate around that time. Jarman smiles, saying that this is clearly a trap. Called comments that the Count explicitly said they should check out the place during the night, which only reinforces the idea that he is indeed a vampire. Jarman is shocked, saying he can't believe it, wondering how the Count thought they would fall for such an obvious trap. The protagonist interrupts everyone and asks if this isn't becoming more problematic. He says that if they ignore that information, the Order will know they are on their trail. If that happens, the Count will suspect everyone there. The three are shocked, saying the protagonist really had a point. Karnak is confused by this, wondering why the three are so slow. Kald asks what they should do, as it will be dangerous if this really is a trap. He emphasizes that he's sure this will be advantageous for the Count. Jarman says he didn't want to say this, but there's nothing they can do. They will have to play their game. At night, in the middle of the forest, in an abandoned house, the whole group was inside. Sarathi thinks everyone was calmer than she expected. Suddenly, she asks how strong vampires are. Jarman says that vampires are just a bit stronger than they were when they were humans. He says there's nothing she needs to fear. Sarathi remains curious and asks if ancient vampires aren't quite strong. Kald answers that, normally, they are discovered very quickly, so it's almost impossible for them to live that long. Still curious, she asks about if an aura user or mage becomes a vampire. Jarman says they wouldn't be able to use aura or magic, so they would become weaker, having to settle only for the dark mana. She says she understands. Jarman laughs and asks if they were worried about something. He emphasizes that it's not cool to be arrogant, but they were the best of the best in the kingdom, saying that a vampire is nothing. Suddenly, a noise is heard outside. The protagonist and Baros immediately become alert. A fireball hits the house they are in, causing a massive explosion. Pieces of the house scatter on the ground, and their screams are heard. Alice had created a barrier in time, protecting everyone. Jarman yells that they really set up an ambush. He asks when they arrived, as he didn't feel anything. Several vampires were there. One of them says he expected this, emphasizing that the protagonist's group was of royal guards, because mere bounty hunters wouldn't be able to escape from that attack. Sarathi notices the aura on their leader's sword and shouts, asking why he was using it if Jarman said they couldn't. Jarman is confused about what's happening. Kald explains that this is Durald, the Count's strongest knight. He wonders why someone with that much strength would become a vampire. Jarman says he's not sure of the details, but the Count has been cooperating with the pagans. He shouts that by the authority given to him, they all are enemies of the goddess and the king. He orders them to kneel and receive the punishment of the royal guard. They start laughing and ask whom they should kneel to. Jarman says that if they don't cooperate, the only option will be to skip the trial. He orders that they all be punished, and without a second thought, Sarathi and Kald advance. Durald also gives his order and commands his soldiers to attack. The vampires begin their assault, and an intense battle ensues between the two groups. With incredible skill and speed, Kald defends against all attacks and manages to strike two vampires. The vampire curses them, saying that such a wound is nothing. However, Alice begins to recite her magic, saying, "Impurity must burn before the goddess of light." A strong light starts emanating from her staff, hitting the vampires and making them scream in pain. They scream that they need to defeat the priestess first. One of the vampires lunges at her, but Jarman says he won't let anyone touch her. He fires a beam of energy and commands his golem to emerge. The ground begins to move, and a gigantic stone golem rises, throwing the vampire away. Seeing that the golem made them lower their guard, Jarman acts again, using his lightning explosion, striking another vampire. Jarman wonders if he really managed to hit the vampire this time. He looks back, thinking that the protagonist was supposed to be a fourth circle mage and his knight. While Jarman ponders this, he sees the protagonist and Baros effortlessly smashing all the vampires. Jarman is confused, thinking they were much stronger than the level that was reported. Baros is able to handle the vampires coming from all sides effortlessly, while Karnak clears the area around them. Their teamwork is flawless, not giving the vampires a single opening to approach. Jarman, seeing this, wonders how such strong people have not yet been recognized. He refocuses on his fight and says it doesn't matter as long as they win. The battle between them continues fiercely. Suddenly, several loud noises are heard. Sarathi is fighting against Durald, causing massive impacts and releasing a huge amount of aura. Jarman thinks that the key point of this fight are the aura users, even though both are Red Knights. Sarathi does not have the same battle experience as Durald. The fight between them starts to take overwhelming proportions, destroying everything around. The pressure cracks the ground, and the trees sway with the force of the wind. Sarathi is pushed back. Durald walks toward her and says that she is beautiful for her age, noting that her skills are also not bad. With a chilling tone, he says that even so, she still isn't a match for him. Sarathi, already out of breath and a bit frightened, just looks at him. The battle continues. The vampires are getting beaten, but they scream for no one to retreat, as they have the blessing of Tezranik. Even if they die, the god of death would reward them with resurrection. Karnak notes that vampires regenerate very quickly, and he didn't expect an aura user to be one of them. Barros asks if Durald entering the fight would cause problems for them. He also asks if Sarathi would be okay. The fight between the two is tense. Sarathi manages to hold her own but cannot counterattack. Annoyed, she thinks she has more energy and experience, but can't find a single opening to attack. She reflects that if someone turned into a vampire, they would lose their aura or mana and would have to start accumulating dark mana from scratch, but this isn't happening, leaving her confused. Durald raises his sword and asks her to observe well, as this was the power granted to him by Tezranik. He says that he can use aura, even being one of the Dark Ones. Telepathically, she asks the protagonist if vampires have any weaknesses, since he must have led many. The protagonist responds that if he knew something like that, the fight would have already ended. Karnak comments that the vampires were so weak that he didn't bother to learn about them. She asks Barros for help dealing with Durald, saying she might not be able to beat him alone. He says that people without aura couldn't help, but that he has the PP plan, suggesting she could use it again. She remembers everything he said before, and is frightened, asking if something could go wrong this time. She thinks it won't work, that she needs to do this alone. Suddenly she starts releasing more of her aura, and says she would blow Durald away with the amount. Karnak watches and wishes her luck, while Barros sighs, saying, "Man." She attacks with a wave of aura. The aura hits Durald, who tries to defend with his sword and asks why she did that suddenly. He manages to defend against the attack, but she advances without hesitation. Durald says that a small increase in power won't make a difference. She attacks him, causing destruction to the ground where he was, but he manages to dodge the attack. Durald shouts, saying he has the power of Tezranik on his side, and attacks her with a wave of aura. She also manages to defend, but is pushed several meters back. Sarathi thinks she can't defeat him by overloading her aura and starts to worry, wondering what she should do. Suddenly Barros says telepathically, "This isn't all, Miss Sarathi." She is confused and asks what he means. Barros says he had already said this last time and asks if she remembers. She recalls that he mentioned her use of aura is inconsistent, because she wastes too much energy in attacks. She needs to learn how to merge her strikes at the right moment and rhythm. He asks her to try to remember when he possessed her body, what the feeling was like. Barros orders her to control her aura and focus as much as possible. Sarathi closes her eyes, trying to concentrate and remember everything Barros did when he used her body. He says that experience is still in her body. Barros says she needs to unify her mind and think of it as a purification of the battle aura around her sword. Sarathi begins to recall all the strikes, movements, and control that Barros demonstrated when he used her body. The aura on her sword starts to become extremely dense and strong. Durald is startled, thinking her battle aura suddenly became sharp. Realizing this, he starts to attack, shouting that no matter what she is plotting, it will be futile. She begins to think, if Mr. Barros were in this situation. Suddenly she opens her eyes, and with frightening speed, lands a blow on Durald, sending him flying. She is surprised, wondering if it really worked. She starts moving very quickly, attacking from various angles and repeatedly. Sarathi reflects that now she understands why Barros could play with her and beat her, even being an aura user. She continues attacking and pressing Durald, while thinking that she shouldn't be aiming at the sword or the opponent's body, but understanding his intention. She tries to attack again, but Durald disappears from in front of her, appearing behind her, shouting that she had a good card up her sleeve, but it was useless against him. She notices him and manages to defend in time. Durald, surprised, asks how she blocked that. Sarathi thinks she needs to anticipate his movements. Durald leaps to attack her, but she just observes him, and the image of Barros appears behind her, as at that moment she was acting in perfect harmony with his memories. She realizes she needs to take advantage of the moments when her opponents slow down. At that instant, she strikes, hitting him in midair. The blow strikes Durald squarely, making him vomit blood. Karnak looks at her impressed, saying that apparently they really don't need to intervene in the fight. Barros agrees, saying she finally got the hang of it. Jarman and the others look at her happily. He comments that apparently she's doing very well, and that they were also managing to contain the vampires. The advantage was finally theirs. Sarathi kept attacking relentlessly, growing faster with each strike. Durald couldn't keep up or defend himself, becoming confused, wondering what was happening as she seemed like a completely different person from before. Durald couldn't accept it, thinking that Tesranik had given him great power. He decided that, even if he had to push beyond his limits, he would end this here and now. He began to scream, and his aura increased, cracking the ground around him. Durald shouted that he would hold back no longer, and attacked with a powerful wave of aura. Kald was shocked by the amount of aura, and yelled that there was no way Durald could be all right after using so much aura at once. Jarman was also impressed and wondered if he was using his body's regeneration to do that. They yelled to Sarathi, warning her that it was dangerous and that she needed to get out of the way. The wave of aura advanced towards her, but she watched everything and thought there was no reason to retreat. She focused and began to release more of her own aura. Sarathi thought that Durald wasn't the only one who could do that. The protagonist and Barros watched silently. She also unleashed her aura attack, thinking she wanted to see who between the two would win. The two attacks collided, and the explosion began to destroy everything, throwing rocks and knocking down trees. The whole group gathered as the pressure from the attacks was very strong. Jarman commented that it was reckless. As the dust began to settle, they saw two people standing. Jarman asked what happened. Suddenly, Durald's head rolled onto the ground. He screamed that this couldn't be happening. Sarathi delivered another blow to his head and began to breathe heavily, exhausted from the fight. Alice ran to heal her. The great battle had ended, and everyone was okay. Sarathi thanked Alice for healing her so quickly. Alice said they should be thanking her, as if it weren't for Sarathi, they would have died. Jarman came over and thanked her for her hard work, emphasizing that because of her, they now had evidence of the Count's crimes. He showed the frozen head of the vampire and asked Alice to contact headquarters and say they were ready to judge the Count's house. A few hours later, at the Count's castle, there were shouts that this was a den of vampires and they should capture everyone, leaving no one behind. Alice used her magic in the name of the goddess to punish all evil. Many vampires began to scream in pain because of it. Inside the office, with a knife in hand, the Count listened to the shouts of the royal knights, ordering them to find him and his son. Sitting at the table, he begged Tesranik to protect his son. Shortly after, he took his own life without hesitation. Outside, a bit away from the house, was the Count's son with two others trying to escape. The two urged him to hurry, as they didn't know when the royal order would start chasing them. The Count's son looked back and saw his father dead. He thought that all this was the fault of the king's order, and in his thoughts, swore to take revenge, no matter what. He swore in the name of Tesranik that he would make that revenge happen. Suddenly, the protagonist appeared, saying he had figured they would be fleeing through there. One of the people screamed, asking who he was. Karnak looked at them and said they couldn't leave a trail of necromantic power like that. They asked if they were part of the king's order. The two stood in front of the Count's son, telling him to run as fast as possible. The other was frightened, asking when they had gotten there. With a serious look, the protagonist used his magic to create a giant hand, grabbing all three at once. They were terrified by such strength, asking if that was necromancy. Karnak started to get excited and squeezed tighter, saying he would end this quickly. Sarathi sighed, asking who the good guys were there. After finishing everyone off, the protagonist began to use his magic on the bodies. Seeing this, Sarathi felt a bit uncomfortable and commented that she never got used to that. The protagonist said he was done. Shortly after, he snapped his fingers, and a strong flame began to burn the bodies. Sarathi is startled and shouts for the protagonist to wait, asking why he was doing that since they needed to report that they had found the fugitives. Karnak responds that it wouldn't work because he had absorbed all the darkness within them. Therefore, there was nothing to show to the order. Sarathi asks why he consumed it all. Barros tells the protagonist that he is starting to accumulate too much necromantic power and emphasizes that the protagonist won't be able to control all that with just chaos magic. He asks if the protagonist is sure about what he is doing. Karnak comments that the situation doesn't seem to allow for such delays. Sarathi asks if there's something worrying him. The protagonist says that both Durald and Straf are concerns. He explains that Straf maintained his sacred powers even as a necromancer, and Durald could use aura even as a vampire. Barros doesn't understand and says that, although it was difficult, they managed to take care of both. Karnak sighs, agreeing that it is true, but the fact that they didn't lose their powers is significant. The protagonist explains that everyone knows that energies don't mix, so to learn one thing, you must give up another. However, that rule was broken with the darkness of the end. Mages can use both magic and necromancy, and aura users can use both aura and necromancy. Barros asks if this wasn't always the case, citing examples like Lich Archers and Death Knights. Karnak explains that in those cases, there is the side effect of becoming undead or losing sanity. However, now a person can maintain their sanity while using their old powers alongside necromancy. The protagonist emphasizes that the strong, who avoided necromancy until now, will start to experiment with it. Thus, they will be able to quickly elevate their power, which was stagnant. The protagonist says that even the fourth martial king and the three great mages might become their enemies, and therefore, just getting a little stronger wouldn't be enough. Karnak comments that he needs to gather as much power as he can. After all this, at the headquarters of the Order of Kings, they are praised for completing the mission. Erantel says that Jarman highly praised the three of them, and even said that it was he who was helped. He comments that, because of this, he was thinking. Erantel asks if they would like to officially join the Order of Kings, based on everything they did on the last mission. He emphasizes that Jarman gave them great recommendations. The protagonist is shocked by this and accepts. Erantel also is pleased and welcomes them to the Order of Kings, handing over a badge. The three celebrate, saying they were going to eat well today. Erantel says that to celebrate their entry, they would need to work. They stop celebrating and ask if they really had to work right now. Erantel points to the desk and says there were many jobs piled up. The three are shocked, wondering if it was a good idea to join such a crazy organization. With this, a few days of work pass. They were eliminating cult members. Sarathi was blowing everything up and cursing them. They were also giving a good lesson to the necromancers. Karnak was eliminating them while they were confused, asking why the Order of Kings was using necromancy. In addition, they were falsifying reports, and of course, seeking as much end darkness as possible. This was their routine every day. During the night, in a room, the protagonist was holding a ball of energy in his hand. He thinks that he had gathered quite a lot of necromantic power. The protagonist creates another ball of energy, thinking now he can separate the mana from the chaos energy and recombine the two. He merges the two energies in his hands and concentrates as much as possible. It becomes a dense and strong energy. He holds it in his hand, saying that the combination was great. He finally reached the sixth circle. The next morning at the headquarters of the Order of Kings, people were talking among themselves. One asks if the other had heard that Karnak was already in the sixth circle of mages. The other person is shocked because he was in the fourth circle just a few days ago. The man comments that perhaps the protagonist has a talent given by God. He smiles, thinking they would never guess that he is a necromancer. Karnak says he hadn't planned this, but when he was studying in the countryside with just one tome, his circles didn't improve. However now, with the resources of the Order of Kings, he managed to reach the sixth circle. Sarathi thinks that people don't know about the end darkness, so how could they suspect the protagonist? Embarrassed, she asks him to stop. They enter Erantel's room, and laughter can be heard from outside. Thrilled, Erantel remarks that it seems they have a great mage among them. The three stand there, while Karnak thinks that indeed no one suspects that he could be a necromancer. Erantel says he has good news for them. He announces that the position of captain of the 7th Division is vacant, and he wants the protagonist to assume it. He says this was decided internally. Karnak can't believe it, and asks if Erantel really wants him for the job. Erantel confirms it, emphasizing that it was a unanimous decision based on the protagonist's contributions, which makes him more than worthy. He says that people have high expectations for the protagonist, and therefore he needs to continue working hard. Karnak understands, but thinks that he just received a promotion, which means he will need to work even harder. He sighs, saying that hunting cult members would be easier, but a week later, in the southeastern part of the Usteel Kingdom, at the Arthra border fortress, in the basement of the central tower, a woman trembles while saying, "Oh, Latiel, grant this sinful soul the sleep of repentance." She thinks this is horrible. This is Melia, from the 7th Division of the Order of Kings, a follower of Latiel, goddess of the sun, a second-level inquisitor. She reflects that inquisitors must torture cultists if necessary. Suddenly, she hears screams coming from inside the room and becomes frightened. She says she can't do it, and thinks, at least, she's glad to be able to stay outside while Captain Karnak does his job because he's a good man. Inside, Barros is beating a man who screams that he has told them everything and pleads for Barros to stop. Barros replies that he doesn't care, while shaking the hot iron, telling the man to keep screaming. The screams echo in the distance. The protagonist remarks that the man was resilient. Sarathi says they've pretended long enough that they were interrogating the man. He responds that Melia would believe them. As the two talk, Barros interrupts, saying that the man died. The protagonist responds that it was obvious he would die because Barros doesn't know when to stop. He stands up and says that it's finally his turn. Suddenly, the guy becomes possessed with a sinister aura, and says that Tesranik is the god of destruction of darkness and earth, as well as the god of Genesis who will bring a new order to this world. The protagonist doesn't believe the nonsense he was hearing. Disappointed, he crouches down, saying that they all believe in this god unironically, and asks how none of them know what's really happening. Sarathi, thinking it over, points out that so far what they have discovered is that the order is governed by 3 leaders. Thus, they have 6 cardinals and 13 archbishops, and the bishops of each region manage their own small organization. The hierarchy is based on the priest, above the bishop, then the archbishop, cardinal, leader, and finally God. She continues saying that they have only captured ordinary priests, so they don't know anything. Baros responds that they need to capture at least 1 bishop. Karnak, annoyed, hopes to catch someone higher in the hierarchy and questions why no major incident occurs. Sometime later, in the office of Arantel, who, reading the report, is astonished to read that there is a rumor of someone from Druntra, the capital, who collaborated with the cult, or something like that. Karnak then asks who the suspect was. Apprehensive, Arantel says that the suspect is the second prince of the kingdom of Usteel, His Highness Alfred Luden Usteel. The 3 are shocked to hear the name, and Karnak thinks that this is definitely something big. In the Usteel kingdom, the current king, Winscott, has 2 sons who are fiercely fighting for succession. The first prince, Lloyd Luden Usteel, and the second prince, Alfred Luden Usteel. Although it makes sense for the first prince Lloyd to succeed the king, he has a tragic story. Melia, from the Count Feeler's family, was accepted into the royal family by an arranged marriage and became the queen. However, her inability to have a child was seen as a significant issue for the future of the families. Thus, to produce an heir, the king had no choice but to accept Calpia from the Marcus Talion family, and 3 months after joining the family, there was news of pregnancy. This child was Lloyd, the first prince. The king was delighted and announced Lloyd as his successor in the name of the goddess Allium. However, it was then that Queen Melia managed to have a child, Alfred, the second prince. The royal family was thrown into confusion. The eldest prince versus the second prince of the direct lineage. As it was hard to determine who was more important, deciding who would succeed the king became a complicated decision. The indecisive King Winscott, who couldn't make up his mind, said, "I will make a decision when both become adults," and ended the discussion. Baros asks the protagonist if the king's postponement of the decision brought much concern. They were in the capital Drunta, on the eastern outskirts of Dalastars. The protagonist asks if Baros doesn't think that the king meant one would be king if something happened to the other. Karnak comments that the 2 families serving the princes for 20 years never stopped fighting. He asks if that isn't interesting. Baros starts laughing, saying it really is a comedy. Sarathi sighs and asks if there isn't a reason to choose based on skills or personality. The protagonist replies that if it were about personality, Lloyd is the calmer and more controlled one, making him more suitable for the throne, while Alfred is violent and arrogant. However, in terms of skills, they haven't had much chance to demonstrate them yet, as they are young. She asks if there's any real reason the king hasn't chosen Lloyd. The protagonist says he heard rumors that Lloyd is incredibly weak, that he has never been healthy for long since childhood. Despite studying fencing for many years, it seems he can't show much. Meanwhile, Prince Alfred is strong and talented in martial arts. Sarathi comments that this really complicates things. Baros asks who reported that Prince Alfred was conspiring with the Black Order. Karnak says that, as far as he knows, it was a spy planted by Prince Lloyd, who apparently discovered this by accident. The protagonist says the prince was cornered and sent a formal report to the Order of Kings before Commander Arantel took over the order. He was the deputy commander of the Imperial Knights, and that's how he recognized the handwriting of the first prince. Karnak says that's all he knows so far, but the order said they would send a messenger with more details. They stop in front of a rundown cafe, and Baros asks if this is where they were going to meet Lloyd's spy. The protagonist tells them to go inside. As they enter, the place is completely dirty. A few people are sitting at a table. Among these people, one is clearly nervous, looking around. Karnak thinks it's obviously that guy. They approach the man and call him over. The man asks what they want. Karnak thinks the situation is bad. Showing the order's insignia, the protagonist asks if he was the one who received orders from Lloyd. The man starts trembling and says he understands. So they are the ones selected by Lord Arantel. Baros notices the atmosphere changing and demands the man identify himself immediately. The man asks what he should do, as all he can do to identify himself is show his face. He starts to remove his mask, and as he reveals himself, everyone is shocked. The protagonist asks if he really is Prince Alfred. Karnak wonders what's going on and thinks if Prince Alfred reported himself. Alfred says that apparently they are confused to see him there. He states he is aware that his face is that of Alfred, but he claims he is not him. He reveals that his real name is Lloyd Luden Usteel, the first prince. the legitimate heir to the throne. After talking for a bit, Karnak asks if the prince was saying that their souls were swapped. Lloyd confirms it. The protagonist thinks that now he understands. He hadn't noticed it before because he was shocked when he saw the face of the second prince. But now that he's looking closer, he can tell that the wrong soul is in that body. The protagonist thinks that the body's shape doesn't align with the soul, which is also disturbed. Lloyd says he knows it's hard for them to understand, but the protagonist says there are some necromancy spells capable of this. Lloyd is pleased to hear this, and says he knew he did a good job when he decided to call the Order of Kings, as he knew they would recognize the necromancy spell. Lloyd asks if the protagonist thinks common mages, outside the Order, would be able to recognize necromancy like that. He says maybe this is easier than he thought. The protagonist responds that no, emphasizing it would be impossible for a mere magic eye. He says he is only able to understand because he can see the facts. Lloyd crosses his arms and asks how the protagonist, a non-necromancer, can believe he is Lloyd. The protagonist says it would be strange for him to act as another person and say that he reported himself. He mentions that members of the Order of Kings also have basic knowledge of necromancy. Lloyd understands, sighs, and asks if there's no way to prove that he is under a necromantic spell. Karnak says they need to think a bit about the facts of this event. He asks Lloyd if he could give details about the day when the souls were swapped. Lloyd starts to think and says it was 5 days ago. That day, he was undergoing his daily sacred magic healing treatment before sleeping. Barros is impressed by this, asking if he really is treated every day with healing magic. Lloyd looks at him and asks if the rumors about his weak body weren't prevalent. A bit embarrassed, Barros admits that it's true, but thinks that even zombies are healthier than Lloyd. He continues his story and says that, without many problems, he began to sleep. The entire property is always protected with a sacred barrier. However, he woke up in his brother's body. He asks if necromancy is really that powerful. Karnak says something doesn't make sense to him. He thinks this means that they managed to conjure a necromantic magic capable of penetrating the barrier. In his thoughts, he says they must have prepared something inside the property, but there was nothing. Lloyd continues his story and says that anyway, he woke up in a strange place. As soon as he opened his eyes, he was confused, wondering where he was. Still confused, he questions why he feels healthy, as he didn't feel any fever or pain. Suddenly, he notices something strange and wonders whose muscular body that is. He looks around and doesn't know where he is. All he can think about is that he might have been kidnapped. Suddenly, some strange people open the door and ask if he was awake. He says he is in a strange place with strange people, not understanding anything, and asks what they did to him. One of the people began to use magic and said they would show him. Lloyd asks how that magic turned into a mirror. As soon as he looks into the mirror, he is astonished because the face he sees is his brother's. The people there say that he and Prince Alfred have swapped bodies. They claim this is the great result of Lord Tesranick. Lloyd asks who Tesranick is. He notices that the people in front of him were cultists and asks why they swapped his and his brother's bodies. Suddenly, a person calls him. As soon as he sees the person, he immediately recognizes him. That man is Sebastian, Alfred's henchman. Lloyd is surprised by this and says he never imagined that he would betray Alfred. Sebastian asks why he betrayed Alfred. Lloyd asks if that's not the case, then for what other reason would they put Alfred in his body? Sebastian begins to laugh and says he understands that really that form was a way to interpret everything that was happening. Lloyd looks at him and thinks, based on Sebastian's reaction, it's clear that Alfred is behind all this. He asks what they want from him. Sebastian unties him and says he wants nothing in particular. Smiling, he says that all Lloyd needs to do is stay there like a good boy. They leave the room and lock the door. Lloyd tries to run, shouting for them to wait. He tells the protagonist that all the windows were sealed with steel bars and the doors were locked. However, he wasn't hating staying there. He smiles and says he was no longer sick and that the meals were great, emphasizing that the happiness of eating good food is incredible. He says he was never able to eat like that, as he always had stomach problems. Barros smiles and says he understands what he means about the happiness of eating. The protagonist says they used to cry after eating simple barley bread. Lloyd is astonished, asking how they could understand that. Sarathi interrupts them and asks how he was able to escape. He says that, about that, they wouldn't believe it, even after hearing this whole story. Lloyd resumes the story and says that one day, after his meal, Lloyd comments that this was the first banquet he had ever attended in his life. This leaves him a bit confused, as he did not understand what those people wanted, treating him so well. He looks out the window, thinking that he wants to get out of there soon, but there are many people watching him. He thinks that they are taking very good care of Alfred's body, and that maybe he has a chance to escape if he uses this body as a hostage. Analyzing the body, he notices that there is a different life force inside it, so maybe he is capable of doing this. At mealtime, one of the knights asks if it is really necessary for 4 elite knights to serve just one meal. He points out that Sebastian is too worried. Another knight comments that the prince barely knows how to hold a sword. The maid knocks on the door, calling Lloyd and telling him it was time to eat. He shouts from the other side, telling them they could come in. They open the door, but do not see the prince anywhere. Suddenly, the prince attacks one of the knights, catching him off guard, and with one blow knocks the knight down. Drawing a sword, he looks at them all without hesitation. The knights scream that he has a sword and is attacking. They say that Lloyd aimed perfectly at a weak point and ask how he managed to do that. They say that Lloyd must be inside Alfred's body. Lloyd says they must be surprised and asks if they ever had to learn fencing with a dying body. The knights are puzzled and ask what he's talking about. Lloyd explains that he had to focus exclusively on strategies and techniques, using few movements. Looking at everyone, he asks what they think will happen now that he has a healthy body. Lloyd charges at everyone, saying that actions speak louder than words, so he would show them personally. Screams and blood fly everywhere. Seconds later, the maid was trembling, frightened, with bodies on the floor and the sword dripping blood. Lloyd looks at her, which scares her even more. He smiles and asks her to stay calm, as he would not hurt her. He leaves the room and asks her to wait there for a while before leaving. As he walked down the corridor, he thought that Alfred was only strong because he had a body like that, and he couldn't help but be disappointed. He thinks he needs to get out of that place as quickly and carefully as possible. Suddenly, 2 guards appear, and Lloyd thinks he is very unlucky. He had barely left the room and already encountered 2 guards. Lloyd grips his sword firmly and thinks he needs to take care of them right there and then. The guards ask where he was going, since it was time for his meal, but the guards were addressing him as Alfred. Lloyd is a little confused, as the guards did not show concern or anger at seeing him walking there. He wonders if they did not know he was Lloyd. Lloyd explains to the protagonist that only a few people knew that their bodies had been swapped with necromancy. He says that thanks to this, he managed to jump over the wall pretending he was going for a walk. Lloyd comments that, unfortunately, he has nowhere to stay with that body, as his servants would not believe him. That's when he decided to ask for help from the Order of Kings and hid in the slum. He says that this is the end of the story. Karnak says it's good that they capture the cultists who did this, but emphasizes that the only problem is that when the cultists hide, it's hard to find them. The protagonist says they probably already evacuated the mansion where they held Lloyd and went to another place. Lloyd asks what they should do, questioning whether the Order of Kings would send scouts to track those people. Karnak says he can't waste time while they don't know what Alfred is planning. He stresses that they need to make the necromancers come to them personally. Determined, Lloyd says he will serve as bait, but the protagonist says that might not be enough, as knights would be sufficient to capture him. Lloyd asks if there is another option. The protagonist begins to laugh and says they will prepare a bait that no necromancer could refuse. He says he has a plan. A few days later, on the outskirts of the hideout of Prince Alfred's supporters inside the mansion, Sebastian was worried, asking where Lloyd had hidden, stressing that if he had contacted his supporters, it could cause a big problem. Another man says that wouldn't happen, as the spies they planted in the palace hadn't said anything. This man is from the Order of the Black God, a necromancer and 5th Circle mage, Bishop Detzrus. One of Detzrus's direct subordinates, a necromancer named Borson, says that if Prince Lloyd were plotting something, they would know. Another necromancer, also a direct subordinate named Olt Gelferent, agrees, saying that they also prepared measures against his possible moves. Borson states that they just need to bring Prince Alfred's body there at the right time. Detzrus uses some of his magic and says that the necromancy spell he cast, Soul Change Ring, was still intact, which means they wouldn't have problems. They comment that even without problems, they should stay alert. One of them asks if it's not possible to use necromancy to find the body. Detzrus replies that if it were possible, they would have done it already. He explains that all conditions need to be met, and even then, the spellcasters do not know all of them. Detzrus says the only way is to keep searching on foot. While they were talking, a person opens the door saying that the prince had been found. Sebastian is surprised by the news and asks where they found him. The man answers that it was in the south, near Delane Street. Sebastian thinks that's where Lloyd's supporters are. He asks if their men had already made contact with them. The man replies that apparently not yet. Sebastian says it's a relief and asks them to send the Crimson Flame Squadron after them. Sebastian sighs with relief, commenting that he can finally bring His Highness home. Meanwhile, on Delane Street, some men were watching a young man walking. The man turns and enters an alley. All the others start to follow him. Lloyd turns and asks if they had any business with him. The men say they were there to bring Prince Alfred back. Lloyd turns and asks if he looks like Alfred to them. The men are confused, thinking they had heard that he wasn't thinking straight. They state they received orders to take him to a certain place, even if he resisted, saying it was for his own good. Suddenly, Sarathi appears in front of him, asking if the prince was all right. The men ask who she is. She stands up, looks straight at them, and states that they were trying to take the prince away. Well, let them try. Various energies begin to emanate from her, and the men get scared. They scream, asking what that sudden cold they were feeling was. Several spirits begin to appear at the location, and the men ask if those could be evil spirits from a necromancer. The spirits begin to attack the men, who scream that a necromancer was controlling the prince. Not knowing how to face this, they scream for everyone to run as fast as possible. They start to flee, and necromancy holes appear with tentacles coming out of them. The tentacles begin to grab the men and crush them. From the alley, only screams, blood, and tentacles were visible. A single man manages to escape. Lloyd is frightened by all that power, thinking the scene was horrible, and wonders if that was really magic. 2 days earlier, in the slum of Runta, at Karnak's group's hideout, Lloyd asks what the bait for the necromancer would be. He asks the protagonist to explain his plan in detail. Sarathi observes the prince, commenting that he was looking elegant and dressed quickly. Karnak explains that necromancers are afraid of being exposed and often do not show themselves unless it is to face a strong opponent. Therefore, they would use an enemy with the same conditions. The protagonist says they would use a necromancer as bait. Lloyd is surprised by this and spits out his drink. The protagonist explains that they will not wait to call the order. If they join forces with necromancers, they can also become stronger. He explains that necromancers can steal powers from each other to become stronger, so they will surely show up. Lloyd says the idea is good, but collaborating with a necromancer is still. Karnak says it will only seem like they did that. The protagonist comments that if they use the confiscated goods of necromancers along with magic to deceive them, smiling, the protagonist says it will be impossible for an ordinary necromancer to suspect this. The protagonist thinks he was blatantly lying about that. Lloyd agrees and says that if the Order of Kings sees such actions as necessary, then they can proceed with the plans. Sarathi asks who would pretend to be the necromancer and hopes it is not her. Back in the present, in the end, she thinks it was her, and sadly says she is depressed. The protagonist asks if Lloyd was injured. He responds that, thanks to Sarathi, he was fine. He says that, putting that aside for a moment, everything he saw looked a lot like necromancy, even though he knew it was magic. Karnak smiles, saying that is a relief. Sarathi thinks it looked real because it was real. Lloyd comments that, in the midst of the confusion, he managed to see that one of them escaped, and asks if that would be enough. The protagonist replies that yes, because the one who fled will report everything he saw. Now, they just need to wait for the necromancers to take the bait. In the hideout of Alfred's supporters, Sebastian yells asking about necromancy. The man who was reporting says that's exactly it. One of the members of the Crimson Flame Squadron saw it with his own eyes. Sebastian says he is speechless. He comments that Prince Lloyd also cooperated with necromancers. They say it was an eye for an eye. Along with his subordinates, Detzris claims that this is their specialty, so they could leave this matter with them. Sebastian thinks Detzris's skills are reliable and says he will leave this case in his hands.
If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, and like the video. Thank you.